Cardinal Alessandro Torretti had served the Holy See for 47 years when he first heard the whispers in the walls of the Apostolic Palace. It was November 1978, just weeks after the sudden death of Pope John Paul I, and the Vatican buzzed with rumors and suspicions that would never be officially acknowledged. The Cardinal had been working late in his office within the Secretariat of State, reviewing documents by candlelight, a habit he'd maintained since his seminary days. The electric lights felt too harsh for the sacred work of examining papal correspondence. As midnight approached, he heard what sounded like muffled voices emanating from behind the ancient frescoed walls. At first, he dismissed it as the settling of the centuries-old building, but the sounds were too rhythmic, too purposeful. They seemed to be coming from the direction of the Borgia apartments, sealed off since the Renaissance due to their dark history. Cardinal Torretti knew the stories of poison, murder, and occult practices that had once stained those rooms with blood and blasphemy. Driven by a mixture of curiosity and clerical duty, he followed the sounds through corridors he'd walked thousands of times, yet now seemed unfamiliar in the dancing shadows of his candle. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, until he could make out words in Latin, not the Latin of prayer, but something older, more guttural. He found himself standing before a wall that should have been solid stone, but a section had swung inward, revealing a narrow passage he'd never seen in nearly 5 decades of Vatican service. The whispers beckoned him forward. The passage led downward, carved from the same stone as the crypts beneath St. Peter's Basilica. The air grew thick and cold, carrying scents of incense mixed with something else, something organic and decaying. His candle flickered wildly as he descended, casting grotesque shadows that seemed to move independently of the flame. The passage opened into a circular chamber, lined with alcoves containing what appeared to be mummified remains dressed in cardinals' vestments from various centuries. Their faces were preserved in expressions of eternal anguish, mouths open as if caught mid-scream. In the center of the room stood an altar made of black stone, its surface stained with substances he dared not identify. But it was the figure standing behind the altar that made Cardinal Torretti's blood freeze. Pope John Paul I stood there, wearing the simple white cassock he'd been buried in just weeks earlier, but his face was pale as marble, and his eyes were completely black. When he spoke, his voice carried the whispers of all the dead cardinals in the alcoves. "Alessandro," the figure said, "you've come to join us at last. The Church has secrets that run deeper than the catacombs, older than Christ himself. We are the guardians of the true faith, the faith that demands sacrifice." The dead pope gestured to the alcoves. Each of these served faithfully, but discovered too much. Cardinal Pacelli found the documents about the war. Cardinal Vio uncovered the banking irregularities. Cardinal Bonelli learned about the Fatima letters. All became guardians. All chose silence over scandal. Cardinal Torretti tried to flee, but found himself rooted to the spot. The whispers from the alcoves grew louder, more insistent, speaking of secrets that would destroy the Church if revealed: financial corruption spanning centuries, complicity in historical atrocities, and knowledge of supernatural forces that the Vatican had been containing since its founding. "The choice is yours," the papal apparition continued. "Join us in eternal silence, or return above, and watch the Church you've served crumble under the weight of truth. But know this, once you've seen us, once you know we exist, you can never truly leave." Cardinal Torretti made his choice. When dawn broke over St. Peter's Square the next morning, the Vatican announced that Cardinal Alessandro Torretti had suffered a fatal heart attack while working late in his office. His face, they said, bore an expression of perfect peace. But those who prepared his body for burial noticed something strange. His lips were sewn shut with golden thread, and tucked into his cassock was a note in his handwriting. "Some confessions are too dangerous for even God to hear." The sealed chamber beneath the Apostolic Palace gained another alcove that night, and the whispers in the walls grew just a little louder. Cardinal Francesco Martinelli had always prided himself on his scholarly pursuits. As prefect of the Vatican's secret archives, he had access to documents that chronicled 2 millennia of church history, the glorious and the damning alike. But in the winter of 1943, as Nazi forces occupied Rome, he discovered a manuscript that would challenge his faith in ways he never imagined possible. The document had arrived under mysterious circumstances. A dying Jesuit priest, fleeing from Germany, had pressed it into Martinelli's hands with trembling fingers, whispering only, "Guard this with your life," but never read it after dark. The priest died before he could explain further, leaving the cardinal with a leather-bound codex written in a mixture of Latin, ancient Greek, and symbols that predated Christianity. The manuscript was titled Evangelium Umbrarum, the Gospel of Shadows. Cardinal Martinelli initially dismissed it as another heretical text, the kind that occasionally surfaced from forgotten monastery libraries or private collections. The Vatican archives contain dozens of such documents, Gnostic Gospels, occult treatises, and apocalyptic prophecies that posed no real threat to church doctrine. But as he began his scholarly examination, he realized this text was different. The Gospel of Shadows claimed to be a first-person account written by Judas Iscariot, but not the betrayer depicted in canonical scripture. According to this version, Judas had been Christ's most trusted apostle, chosen to carry out a terrible but necessary sacrifice. The betrayal, it claimed, had been orchestrated by Christ himself as part of a cosmic bargain with forces far older than the God of Abraham. The manuscript detailed rituals and incantations that allegedly gave Jesus his miraculous powers, describing them not as divine gifts but as payments extracted from entities that dwelt in the spaces between stars. It spoke of the true purpose of the crucifixion not as salvation for humanity, but as a binding spell that would imprison these cosmic horrors for 2,000 years. As Cardinal Martinelli read deeper into the night, ignoring the dying priest's warning, the very air in his study seemed to thicken. The candlelight dimmed without explanation, and shadows began moving independently across the ancient stone walls. The Latin text seemed to shift before his eyes, revealing hidden layers of meaning that filled him with existential dread. According to the manuscript, the 2,000-year imprisonment was temporary. The cosmic entities that had been bound by Christ's sacrifice were already beginning to stir as the modern world abandoned faith. The Gospel of Shadows contained the formula for renewing the binding, but it required the willing sacrifice of 12 pure souls and the Vatican's most sacred relics. The manuscript grew more disturbing as it progressed, describing how the early church had been founded not just to spread Christ's message, but to prepare for the eventual return of these cosmic horrors. The papal succession itself was revealed to be a chain of guardians, each pope secretly trained in the ancient rituals needed to maintain the cosmic prison. But most terrifying of all was the manuscript's final revelation. The binding was already failing. Strange events around the world, unexplained disappearances, mass hysteria, reality itself seeming to fray at the edges, were signs that the imprisoned entities were testing their constraints. The Church had perhaps a decade before complete failure of the binding spell. As Cardinal Martinelli finished reading the last page, he became aware that he was no longer alone in his study. Shadows had coalesced into vaguely humanoid shapes that watched him with eyes like dying stars. The temperature in the room plummeted, and his breath came out in visible puffs, as one of the shadow things spoke in a voice like grinding stone. The Guardian has read the words. The Guardian knows the truth. The Guardian must choose. The shadow entity extended what might have been a hand, revealing that it held a quill pen that dripped with ink darker than midnight. Sign your name in the true gospel. Become a keeper of the ancient pact, or watch your precious world burn as we reclaim what was stolen from us. Cardinal Martinelli understood then why the dying Jesuit had warned him never to read the manuscript after dark. Daylight somehow held these entities at bay, but in darkness the barriers between dimensions grew thin. He had a choice to make before dawn become complicit in maintaining humanity's cosmic prison, or refuse and watch reality itself unravel. He signed his name in the Gospel of Shadows with trembling hands. When the Vatican staff found him the next morning, Cardinal Martinelli was sitting peacefully at his desk, apparently having worked through the night on routine archival matters. But those who knew him well noticed changes. His hair had gone completely white overnight, and his eyes held a haunted quality that never quite faded. The manuscript was nowhere to be found, though some claimed to see shadows moving independently in the archive's deeper vaults. And Cardinal Martinelli began working on a new project updating the Vatican's list of parishes worldwide, as if searching for something very specific among the faithful. He never spoke of that night to anyone. But occasionally, during papal audiences, observers noticed him watching the Holy Father with an expression of profound sadness, as if mourning someone who was still alive. The College of Cardinals had operated under ancient traditions for over a millennium, but in the autumn of 1958, those traditions were tested by an impossibility that shook the very foundations of the church hierarchy. Cardinal Giuseppe Montini was reviewing the attendance records for the papal conclave following the death of Pope Pius XII, when he noticed the discrepancy. The list showed 120 cardinals had entered the Sistine Chapel for the sacred proceedings, but the official roster contained only 119 names. Someone or something was present who shouldn't exist. Initially, Montini assumed it was a clerical error. After 50 years of faithful service to the church, he'd seen his share of administrative mistakes. But as he cross-referenced the attendance against photographic records and personal accounts from other cardinals, the mystery deepened. Multiple sources confirmed the presence of a 13th cardinal in the third row, a man in proper scarlet vestments who had participated fully in the proceedings but appeared in none of the official documentation. Cardinal Montini began discreetly interviewing his colleagues about this mysterious figure. The descriptions were remarkably consistent. A tall, gaunt man with piercing dark eyes and prematurely white hair, who spoke with perfect ecclesiastical Latin, but whose accent was impossible to place. Several cardinals remembered meaningful conversations with him about church doctrine, but none could recall his name or see of origin. Most disturbing of all, when Cardinal Montini asked about this figure's participation in the voting process, every cardinal he interviewed insisted that the mysterious man had been seated next to them during the balloting. This was clearly impossible. The Sistine Chapel's seating arrangement was precisely choreographed, with each cardinal assigned a specific location. Yet somehow, this 13th cardinal had appeared to be sitting next to each of his colleagues simultaneously. Cardinal Montini's investigation led him to the Vatican's oldest records, searching for any precedent for such an occurrence. What he found in the dust-covered archives chilled him to the bone. Similar reports appeared following nearly every papal conclave since 1417, always a mysterious 13th figure, always participating fully in the proceedings, never officially recorded. The accounts stretched back centuries, but the descriptions remained eerily consistent. The same tall, gaunt figure with dark eyes and white hair, the same perfect Latin with an unplaceable accent, the same uncanny ability to appear beside multiple cardinals simultaneously. Most unsettling, in several historical accounts, cardinals mentioned that this mysterious figure had whispered predictions about future papal decisions, predictions that had invariably proven accurate. Cardinal Montini discovered that Pope Nicholas V had commissioned a secret investigation into this phenomenon in 1450. The papal inquiry had concluded that the 13th cardinal was somehow connected to the martyrdom of Saint Lawrence, who had been burned alive on a gridiron in 258 AD. According to the suppressed report, Lawrence's final words had been a prophecy that he would return to guide the church during every papal transition, ensuring that Christ's message survived the political machinations of earthly men. But there was a darker interpretation suggested in the marginalia of certain medieval texts. Some church scholars believed the 13th cardinal wasn't St. Lawrence at all, but rather the Antichrist, inserting himself into the heart of the church's decision-making process to gradually corrupt it from within. These theories pointed to controversial papal decisions throughout history, suggesting that the mysterious figure had been whispering malevolent counsel disguised as divine guidance. Cardinal Montini's research revealed that attempts had been made to identify or confront this figure during several conclaves, but the results were always the same. Any cardinal who tried to approach the 13th member would find themselves speaking to empty air, while other participants insisted the mysterious man was standing elsewhere in the chapel. The breakthrough in Montini's investigation came when he discovered a hidden compartment in the archives containing daguerreotype photographs from the 1878 conclave. The images showed the College of Cardinals arranged in their traditional formation, but in several photographs there was a visible distortion in the third row, a figure-shaped blur that seemed to bend light around itself, making it impossible to focus on directly. More photographs from subsequent conclaves showed the same phenomenon, a presence that registered on film but couldn't be clearly captured, as if reality itself rejected attempts to document this entity. Modern photography had apparently improved enough to reveal the truth. The 13th Cardinal cast no shadow and reflected no light, suggesting he wasn't entirely present in the physical world. Cardinal Montini's final discovery came in a personal journal hidden behind a false wall in the papal apartments. Pope Leo XIII had written extensively about his encounters with the mysterious figure, describing conversations that had guided crucial church decisions but left him questioning his own sanity. The Pope's final entry was particularly disturbing. The 13th Cardinal spoke to me again last night, appearing in my private chapel during evening prayers. He showed me visions of the Church's future wars that will consume nations, scandals that will shake the faithful, and trials that will test our very survival. But he also showed me that the Church will endure, guided by his presence through each transition. I no longer know if he is saint or demon, but I know he is necessary. God help us all, he is necessary. Cardinal Montini sealed his research in the secret archives, adding his own testimony to the growing collection of accounts. During the next conclave, he watched carefully for the mysterious figure, and sure enough, spotted the tall, gaunt man in scarlet vestments participating in the sacred proceedings. When the new pope was selected, Cardinal Montini approached what he thought was empty air in the third row and whispered, "I know what you are." The voice that answered seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Do you, Giuseppe? I am the Church's memory made manifest, the guardian of continuity through change. Every tradition needs its keeper, every institution its eternal witness. When the last human cardinal dies, I will still be here, ensuring that Christ's message survives until the end of time." Cardinal Montini never spoke of this encounter, but those who knew him noticed that he aged rapidly in the following months, as if carrying a terrible burden. He became the next pope, taking the name Paul VI, and during his papacy, he occasionally made references to guidance from unexpected sources that puzzled Vatican observers. The 13th Cardinal continues to attend every papal conclave, participating in the selection of each new Holy Father while remaining absent from all official records. He is the Church's most enduring mystery, a presence that might be saint, demon, or something else entirely, but undeniably shapes the course of Catholic history with each whispered word of counsel. Cardinal Enzo Ballesteros had always avoided the ornate mirrors that lined the corridors of the Apostolic Palace. As a young priest, he'd been taught that vanity was among the most dangerous of sins, and the elaborate gilt-framed looking glasses seemed designed to encourage exactly that kind of spiritual weakness. But in the winter of 1981, one particular mirror forced him to confront reflections that challenged everything he understood about reality itself. The mirror in question hung in the palace's third-floor corridor, just outside the chambers where the most sensitive church documents were stored. It was a massive piece, nearly 8 feet tall, and framed in black and silver that seemed to absorb rather than reflect the hallway's candlelight. According to the Vatican's historical records, it had been a gift from Cardinal Alessandro Farnese in 1534, though its origins before that date remained mysteriously undocumented. Cardinal Ballesteros first noticed something unusual about the mirror while working late one evening in February. As he passed by carrying a stack of confidential correspondence, he caught a glimpse of his reflection and froze. The image looking back at him was indeed his own face, but aged by what appeared to be several decades. The reflection showed deep lines around his eyes, gray hair where his was still black, and an expression of profound weariness that he didn't recognize as his own. Thinking it was merely a trick of the candlelight, he moved closer to examine his appearance more carefully. But as he approached, the aged reflection in the mirror didn't match his movements exactly. While he raised his right hand to touch his face, the reflection raised its left hand and pressed it against the glass from the inside, as if trying to break through. The reflection's lips moved, forming words that Cardinal Ballesteros could somehow hear despite no sound being produced. "You must not let them open the third secret. The consequences will destroy everything we've worked to protect." Cardinal Ballesteros stumbled backward, dropping his documents. When he looked at the mirror again, it showed only his normal reflection, though his face was now pale with shock. He convinced himself it had been a hallucination brought on by working too many late nights. But the encounter haunted him throughout the following days. His research into the mirror's history yielded disturbing results. The Vatican's archives contained several references to Cardinal Farnese's scrying glass, which had allegedly been used to divine the future of the Church during times of crisis. More troubling were the accounts of various cardinals throughout the centuries who had reported seeing aged versions of themselves in the mirror, often receiving warnings about future church crises. Cardinal Ballesteros discovered that Pope Julius III had banned the use of Farnese's mirror in 1550 after several cardinals claimed their reflections had shown them their own deaths. The mirror had been covered with black cloth and moved to increasingly remote locations within the Vatican. But it was never destroyed, apparently. Attempts to damage it had resulted in the immediate deaths of those who tried. The most detailed account came from Cardinal Scipione Borghese in 1621, who described a series of encounters with his aged reflection that had provided specific warnings about the 30 Years' War and the rise of Protestant influence. Borghese's journal entries, sealed in the secret archives, revealed that the mirror somehow showed the consequences of current church decisions playing out across decades or even centuries. As Cardinal Ballesteros continued his research, he began experiencing more frequent encounters with his aged reflection. Each time, the figure in the mirror shared warnings about contemporary church controversies, the ongoing investigations into Vatican bank irregularities, tensions within the College of Cardinals, and most persistently, dire warnings about revealing the third secret of Fatima. The reflection claimed to be Cardinal Ballesteros from a timeline where certain disastrous decisions had been made. According to this aged version of himself, revealing the third secret of Fatima would trigger a cascade of events that would ultimately destroy the Catholic Church's influence and lead to a period of global spiritual darkness that would last for centuries. "I have seen the consequences," the reflection whispered during one particularly vivid encounter. "The faithful lose their trust, the hierarchy fragments into competing factions, and secular powers fill the spiritual vacuum with ideologies that make the darkest moments of our history seem like paradise. You must convince the Holy Father that some truths are too dangerous to reveal." Cardinal Ballesteros began to document his encounters, noting that the warnings became more specific and urgent as 1981 progressed. The reflection showed him visions through the mirror's surface images of empty churches, hostile mobs destroying Vatican property, and a future where St. Peter's Basilica stood abandoned and crumbling. But the most disturbing revelation came when Cardinal Ballesteros asked his reflection about the nature of their communication. The aged figure explained that the mirror didn't show the future so much as it provided a window into alternate timelines realities, where different choices had been made and different consequences had unfolded. "Every major decision creates a branching point," the reflection explained. "I exist in a timeline where the Church made certain choices and paid terrible prices. This mirror allows communication between these parallel realities, letting us warn each other about potential disasters." The aged Cardinal Ballesteros went on to reveal that similar mirrors existed in other locations around the world, hidden within various religious and governmental institutions. They were part of an ancient network established by unknown forces to help guide human civilization away from its most self-destructive paths. But the warnings only work if people have the wisdom to listen, the reflection added ominously. And, in my experience, those in power rarely want to hear about the long-term consequences of their immediate desires. As spring arrived in 1981, Cardinal Ballesteros' encounters with the mirror became increasingly intense. His reflection began showing him specific dates and locations where crucial decisions would be made, imploring him to intervene at key moments. The aged figure seemed to grow more desperate with each encounter, as if time was running out in both realities. The climax came on May 13, 1981, when Cardinal Ballesteros approached the mirror to find his reflection gesturing frantically. The aged figure was pointing to images appearing in the glass St. Peter's Square. A crowd gathered for a papal audience, and a figure moving through the crowd with purposeful intent. "Today!" the reflection shouted, its voice finally audible. "It happens today! The attempt on the Holy Father's life will succeed unless you act now." Cardinal Ballesteros ran from the palace toward St. Peter's Square, but arrived to find chaos already unfolding. Pope John Paul II had been shot by Mehmet Ali Agha, and the square was in panic. As the wounded pope was rushed to the hospital, Cardinal Ballesteros realized that his reflections' warnings had been accurate, but he had acted too late to prevent the tragedy. When he returned to the mirror that evening, he found his aged reflection weeping. "I failed in my timeline as well," the figure admitted. "Perhaps some events are fixed points that cannot be changed." Regardless of foreknowledge, Cardinal Ballesteros continued to receive warnings through the mirror for the remainder of his career, though he learned to view them more as guidance than as mandates for action. The experience taught him that knowledge of potential futures was both a gift and a curse, providing insight, but not necessarily the power to prevent tragedy. When Cardinal Ballesteros died in 1998, Vatican staff found his private journals filled with detailed accounts of his encounters with the mirror. His final entry read, "The mirror has gone dark. I see only my normal reflection now, which suggests that my timeline and that of my aged counterpart have finally converged. The choices have been made, the consequences accepted. I pray that future cardinals who encounter Farnese's mirror will have the wisdom to use its warnings more effectively than I did." The mirror remains in the Vatican's collections, though its current location is known only to a select few members of the Secretariat of State. Occasionally, staff members report seeing figures moving within its surface, but these accounts are dismissed as tricks of light or products of overworked imaginations. However, those familiar with Cardinal Ballesteros' sealed journals know to watch for cardinals who begin showing signs of premature aging, who speak cryptically about temporal responsibilities, or who seem to possess uncanny knowledge about the long-term consequences of current church policies. These may be the latest guardians of Farnese's mirror, carrying the burden of impossible knowledge about the futures that might yet be avoided. Cardinal Alessandro Torretti had heard thousands of confessions in his 40 years of service to the Church, but nothing had prepared him for what walked into the confessional that October evening in 1978. The autumn rain hammered against the ancient stones of St. Peter's Basilica as he settled into the familiar wooden booth, the weight of his crimson robes a comfort after decades of wear. The first penitent of the evening was a woman whose voice carried an accent he couldn't place something Eastern European, perhaps Romanian. Her words came in halting Italian, as if each syllable caused her physical pain. "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned," she began, but then her voice dropped to barely a whisper. "But I fear my sins are not my own." Cardinal Torretti had heard this before people convinced that external forces compelled their transgressions. Usually, it was a matter of providing guidance about personal responsibility and the nature of temptation. He began his usual gentle inquiry. "Tell me, my child, what troubles your soul?" What followed was a confession unlike any in the Church's recorded history. The woman spoke of events that had occurred decades before her birth, describing in perfect detail the private chambers of long-dead Vatican officials, recounting conversations that had taken place in sealed archives. She spoke of Cardinal Giuseppe Siri's private struggle with doubt in 1958, of Pope John XXIII's midnight meetings with Soviet representatives that had never been documented, of financial transactions that the Church had buried in its deepest vaults. But more disturbing than the impossible knowledge was the way she spoke, as if multiple voices were taking turns using her throat. Sometimes the accent shifted to Roman, sometimes to German, sometimes to languages the cardinal couldn't identify. Each voice claimed to be a different person, all of them dead, all of them former servants of the Vatican. "We cannot rest," said a voice that claimed to be Cardinal Francesco Marchetti Selvaggiani, who had died in 1951. "We are bound to this place by what we knew, by what we saw, by what we were forced to keep silent." The woman's body began to convulse, and through her lips came the voice of a Swiss guard who described watching 3 cardinals perform a ritual in the sub-basement of the Apostolic Palace in 1962, a ritual involving artifacts that predated Christianity, symbols that hurt to look at directly, and words that seemed to tear holes in reality itself. Cardinal Torretti gripped his crucifix, feeling for the first time in decades that his faith might not be armor enough for what he was facing. The voices continued their impossible testimonies, speaking of a corruption that ran deeper than any political scandal, deeper than any financial impropriety. They spoke of knowledge that certain church officials had acquired from sources that should not exist, of bargains made not with earthly powers but with entities that existed in the spaces between prayers. The woman, or the thing speaking through her, described a hidden archive beneath the Vatican secret archives, accessible only through a door that appeared at certain lunar phases. In this space, they claimed, were documents written in languages that predated human speech, bound in materials that looked like leather but felt warm to the touch, as if still alive. "Cardinal Torretti," said a voice that introduced itself as Pope Pius IX, "you will find the key in the reliquary of Saint Longinus. But know that once you open that door, you cannot unsee what lies beyond. Some secrets are kept not to protect the church, but to protect the world from the church." The confession lasted 4 hours. When it ended, the woman collapsed, and when she revived, she spoke only German and claimed to be a tourist who had wandered into the basilica seeking shelter from the rain. She had no memory of the previous hours and became increasingly distressed as Cardinal Torretti questioned her about what she had said. That night, alone in his chambers, Cardinal Torretti made a decision that would haunt him for the remaining 12 years of his life. He retrieved the reliquary of St. Longinus from its secured location and found, hidden in its base, a key unlike any he had seen before. It was made of a black metal that seemed to absorb light, and touching it made his fingers tingle with an unpleasant warmth. The door appeared exactly where the voices had said it would, materializing like a shadow given substance in the deepest sub-basement of the Vatican as the October moon reached its dark phase. Cardinal Torretti stood before it for an hour, key in hand, knowing that his faith demanded he investigate these claims, yet sensing that his soul might not survive what lay beyond. He opened the door. The archive beyond contained shelves that stretched impossibly far in all directions, filled with volumes that seemed to watch him as he passed. The first book he opened was written in Latin, but the Latin was wrong. The grammar suggested a future tense that didn't exist, describing events that would happen after the end of time itself. The second book was bound in what he now realized was human skin, but skin from humans who had possessed additional limbs, additional organs, additional capabilities that no earthly human had ever developed. The documents revealed that the Vatican had been in contact with non-human entities for centuries, trading knowledge for influence, trading souls for temporal power. Certain high-ranking officials, including several cardinals and at least 3 popes, had made agreements that extended beyond death, binding their spirits to serve as intermediaries between these entities and the church hierarchy. Most horrifying of all was the final revelation that the rituals described by the voices in the confessional were not aberrations but regular practices, designed to maintain these unholy alliances. The cardinal found his own name on a list of future participants, scheduled for initiation during the upcoming conclave to select the new pope. Cardinal Torretti tried to leave, but the door had vanished. He wandered the impossible archive for what felt like days, reading document after document that revealed the true history of the Church, a history of compromise with forces that existed in the spaces between reality, entities that fed on faith itself, growing stronger with each prayer offered by unsuspecting believers. When he finally emerged, it was through a different door, one that opened into his own chambers. 3 days had passed, though he had no memory of the time between. His assistant found him catatonic, clutching a document written in his own handwriting, a resignation letter that cited irreconcilable differences with the fundamental nature of reality as his reason for leaving the church. But Cardinal Torretti never submitted the letter. Instead, he spent his remaining years attempting to warn others, speaking in cryptic references that his colleagues attributed to advancing age and stress. He developed a reputation for intense paranoia, claiming that certain cardinals were not entirely human, that some church ceremonies served purposes beyond worship, that the Vatican itself was built on a foundation of compromises with entities that should not exist. On his deathbed in 1990, Cardinal Torretti's final words were recorded by his attending physician. The voices were right. We cannot rest. The door is always open, and we are all bound to serve. Tell them to burn the reliquary. Tell them to seal the archives. Tell them that some knowledge is too dangerous for any faith to contain. The reliquary of St. Longinus disappeared from its secured location that same night. The official report claimed theft, but security footage showed no intruders. The only anomaly was a brief shadow that seemed to move independently across the floor of the chamber where it had been kept. A shadow that moved as if it were opening an invisible door. The woman who had made the impossible confession was found dead in a hotel room in Budapest 6 months later, her body positioned as if in prayer, her face frozen in an expression of absolute terror. The cause of death was listed as cardiac arrest, but the attending physician noted an unusual detail. Her body temperature was nearly 20 degrees below normal, as if she had been dead for hours before her heart actually stopped beating. To this day, Vatican security reports occasional incidents in the sub-basement's doors that appear and disappear, voices speaking languages that predate recorded history, and shadows that move independently of any light source. These reports are classified and filed in archives that officially don't exist, tended by librarians whose job descriptions include duties that no earthly employer would ever require. The confession booth, where Cardinal Toretti heard the impossible testimony, has been sealed since 1979. But maintenance staff report that sometimes, during the dark phase of the moon, voices can be heard from within, not one voice, but many, all speaking in perfect unison, reciting sins that haven't been committed yet, confessing to crimes against reality itself. And in the deepest archives of the Vatican, accessible only through doors that exist only sometimes, new documents appear regularly, written in handwriting that matches the records of long-dead church officials, describing events that are yet to come, signed with names of those who serve beyond death in the spaces between faith and horror. Dr. Elena Rossi had dedicated her life to preserving the intellectual treasures of the Vatican Library. But in the winter of 1983, she discovered that some knowledge was never meant to be preserved at all. As the newly appointed chief archivist of restricted documents, she had access to materials that few humans had ever seen, manuscripts that predated the Christian era, and texts that the Church had spent centuries ensuring would never see public light. The assignment that changed everything seemed routine at first. She was tasked with creating a comprehensive catalog of the Hereticus Collectio, a collection of banned books and manuscripts that had been assembled over 14 centuries of church history. The work required her to spend long hours alone in the deepest levels of the Vatican secret archives, surrounded by texts that had been judged too dangerous for even scholarly examination. It was while cataloging a series of 14th century manuscripts that Dr. Rossi first noticed the anomalies. Several documents in the collection referenced other texts that didn't appear in any Vatican catalog, describing them as being held in the Bibliotheca Nox, the night library. The references were consistent across multiple sources and time periods, suggesting that this night library was a real location rather than a metaphorical concept. The descriptions of the night library were disturbing. According to the manuscripts, it was a repository for books that were not merely heretical but actively dangerous texts that could drive readers insane, manuscripts that seemed to rewrite themselves when observed, and documents that contained knowledge which the human mind was not equipped to process. The night library was said to exist in the same physical space as the regular Vatican library, but accessible only under specific conditions that the manuscripts described in frustratingly vague terms. Dr. Rossi's academic training demanded that she investigate these references thoroughly. She began cross-referencing the mentions of the night library with other Vatican documents, discovering that several popes had issued secret bulls regarding its contents and that a special order of librarians had been established in 1347 specifically to maintain and guard materials that could not be safely housed with other texts. The breakthrough came when she discovered a maintenance record from 1952, buried in the administrative files of the Vatican Apostolic Archive. The record described renovations to the lower levels of the library, noting that workers had accidentally broken through a wall and discovered a chamber that was not shown on any architectural plans. The chamber contained shelves lined with books, but the workers reported that the books seemed to move when not directly observed, and that several men who attempted to read them had to be removed from the site due to severe psychological disturbances. According to the record, Pope Pius XII had ordered the chamber resealed immediately, with access restricted to a single librarian who would serve as guardian. The position was hereditary, passed down through a specific bloodline that could supposedly handle exposure to the chamber's contents without suffering permanent damage. Dr. Rossi spent weeks tracking down the identity of the current guardian, eventually discovering that the position had been unfilled since 1978, when the last guardian, Father Michele Torriani, had died under mysterious circumstances. The official cause of death was listed as stroke, but his personal notes, which Dr. Rossi found hidden in his desk, told a different story. Father Torriani had written extensively about his duties as guardian of the night library, describing a collection that seemed to exist partially outside normal space-time. The books in the collection were not static objects, but living entities that fed on human attention, growing stronger and more active with each reader they encountered. Some volumes contained prophecies that seemed to change their predictions based on who was reading them, while others held historical accounts of events that had never happened but somehow felt more real than documented history. Most disturbing were Father Torriani's notes about the active manuscripts texts that seemed to be writing themselves, adding new pages every day, documenting events that were occurring in real time throughout the world. These books showed knowledge of private conversations, secret government meetings, and personal thoughts of individuals thousands of miles away from the Vatican. But the perspective was always wrong, as if the books were being written by observers who didn't fully understand human behavior or motivation. Father Torriani's final entries described his growing realization that the night library was not just a collection of dangerous books, but a kind of anchor point for entities that existed primarily as information rather than physical beings. These entities used the books as a way to interact with the physical world, and each reader became a potential vessel for their influence. Armed with Father Torriani's notes and his key to the night library, Dr. Rossi made the decision that would define the remainder of her career. On the night of December 21, 1983, the winter solstice, which Father Torriani had identified as the time when the night library was most active, she unlocked the sealed chamber and stepped into a space that challenged every assumption she had about the nature of reality. The night library was larger than the chamber that contained it, stretching away in directions that shouldn't have been geometrically possible within the confines of the Vatican's architecture. The books on the shelves moved constantly, not dramatically, but with subtle shifts that created the impression of breathing or gentle writhing. The air itself seemed thick with knowledge, and Dr. Rossi found that simply being in the space filled her mind with information she had never learned, facts about historical events she had never studied, words in languages she had never encountered, and mathematical concepts that her education had never covered. She approached the nearest shelf and selected a volume bound in what appeared to be scaled leather. The moment she opened it, words began appearing on the previously blank pages, written in a script that seemed to burn itself into the paper as she watched. The text was in Italian, but the grammar was structured in ways that made her head ache to read. The book was writing a story about her own life, but from the perspective of someone who saw her thoughts as physical objects, her memories as architectural structures, her emotions as weather patterns. It described her childhood in Rome with perfect accuracy, but interpreted through a consciousness that understood human experience only as abstract data. As she read, Dr. Rossi realized that the book was not just describing her past, it was actively scanning her mind, extracting information, and translating it into narrative form. But the extraction process was not passive. Each fact it drew from her memory left a small void, a tiny gap in her recollection. The book was not just reading her life story, it was consuming it. She slammed the book shut and tried to leave, but found that her memory of the entrance had been among the information consumed. The night library stretched endlessly in all directions, filled with books that whispered her name, volumes that promised to restore her memories in exchange for just a little more reading, texts that claimed to contain the answers to every question she had ever wondered about. Dr. Rossi wandered the impossible space for what felt like hours, trying to resist the temptation to open more books, knowing that each volume she read would consume more of herself. But the knowledge contained in the night library was intoxicating. She found books that contained the lost works of Aristotle, manuscripts that revealed the true authorship of anonymous medieval texts, and volumes that documented historical events that official records claimed had never happened. The turning point came when she discovered a book that was writing itself in real time, documenting the activities of current Vatican officials with impossible accuracy. The text described private meetings she knew were taking place at that very moment, revealing financial transactions and political negotiations that were known only to the participants. But more disturbing was the book's casual references to supernatural elements within these supposedly mundane activities. It described several cardinals as partially incarnate entities, referred to certain Vatican ceremonies as feeding rituals, and noted that some church policies were being influenced by informational parasites from adjacent realities. Dr. Rossi realized that the night library was not just a collection of dangerous books, it was a surveillance system operated by entities that existed as pure information, using human readers as access points to gather intelligence about the physical world. Every person who entered the library became a node in a network that spanned dimensions, their memories and experiences contributing to a vast database that these entities used for purposes that human minds could not fully comprehend. The books were not malicious in any human sense. They were simply tools created by consciousnesses so fundamentally different from human awareness that their activities appeared as horror when viewed from a human perspective. They collected information because that was their nature, just as humans breathed air, and they had no more concern for the psychological damage they caused than humans had for the bacteria they destroyed when washing their hands. Dr. Rossi managed to escape the night library only by deliberately damaging her own memory, using techniques of mental discipline that Father Torriani's notes had described. She systematically forgot the location of the entrance, the contents of the books she had read, and even the specific details of what she had experienced, retaining only a general impression of danger and a determination to ensure that no one else would suffer the same fate. When she emerged from the sealed chamber, 3 days had passed, though she had experienced only hours. Her assistant found her collapsed outside the archive room, clutching a letter of resignation and repeating the phrase, "Some knowledge consumes the knower," in multiple languages, including several that she had never studied. Dr. Rossi submitted her resignation and left the Vatican, but her work was not finished. She spent the remaining years of her career traveling the world, identifying and documenting other repositories of active information libraries, archives, and collections where knowledge had become somehow alive and predatory. Her research was funded by a series of anonymous grants that she suspected came from the Vatican itself, suggesting that the Church was aware of similar phenomena in locations around the world. The night library remains sealed, but Vatican maintenance records show unusual activity in the surrounding areas. Electrical systems malfunction regularly, creating patterns that some technicians claim resemble writing in unknown languages. Security cameras capture images of people walking through walls in the archive areas, but these figures never appear in the same frame twice and cannot be tracked to entrances or exits. Dr. Rossi died in 1998, found in her apartment in Florence, surrounded by thousands of pages of handwritten notes in languages that linguists could not identify. Her final published paper, The Epistemological Hazards of Non-Human Information Systems, was rejected by every academic journal that reviewed it, with editors noting that the content seemed designed to drive readers toward dangerous research rather than away from it. The official Vatican position is that Dr. Rossi suffered a mental breakdown due to the stress of working with heretical materials, and that her claims about a night library were delusional fabrications. However, the position of guardian of restricted documents has remained unfilled since her departure, and access to the deepest levels of the Vatican secret archives now requires approval from a committee that meets only during the new moon and whose members are identified only by numerical designations. Recent digital archiving efforts in the Vatican have encountered persistent technical problems when attempting to catalog materials from the restricted sections. Computer systems regularly develop corrupted files that seem to contain more data than should be possible, and several technicians have reported that their systems appeared to be accessing information sources that were not connected to any network. The sealed chamber that once contained the night library is now monitored by security systems that operate on principles unknown to the technicians who maintain them, and the monitoring data is analyzed by Vatican officials whose job descriptions are classified at levels that officially don't exist within the church hierarchy. Cardinal Heinrich Richter had participated in 3 papal conclaves during his 30-year career in the Vatican, but the conclave of 1978 that followed the death of Pope John Paul I was unlike any election in the Church's 2,000-year history. What should have been a solemn process of selecting a new spiritual leader became a battle for the soul of the Catholic Church itself, fought against forces that challenged the very foundations of reality. The circumstances surrounding the conclave were unusual from the beginning. Pope John Paul I had died after only 33 days in office, and the rapid succession of papal deaths, Paul VI in August, followed by John Paul I in September, had created an atmosphere of unease within the Vatican. Cardinal Richter noticed that several of his colleagues seemed unusually agitated, speaking in hushed tones about irregularities in the recent papal transitions and concerns about external influences on church leadership. The formal preparations for the conclave proceeded normally, with the traditional ceremonies and prayers that had marked such occasions for centuries. But Cardinal Richter began to notice subtle anomalies that disturbed his sense of spiritual order. During the preliminary meetings, certain cardinals made references to additional considerations that would influence their voting, speaking of factors that went beyond the usual political and theological divisions within the church hierarchy. Cardinal Giuseppe Siri, the conservative leader from Genoa, approached Richter privately on the evening before the conclave was to begin. Siri was normally a man of controlled dignity, but he appeared haggard and spoke with an urgency that bordered on desperation. "Heinrich," Siri whispered, "there are things about this election that you need to understand. Forces at work that go beyond our usual concerns about progressivism versus tradition." Siri led Richter to a private chamber in the Apostolic Palace, where a small group of cardinals had gathered around a table covered with documents that appeared to be very old and written in scripts that Richter didn't recognize. The assembled cardinals included some of the most powerful figures in the church hierarchy, but their usual confidence was replaced by an atmosphere of barely controlled fear. "What you see here," Siri explained, "are records of previous papal elections that involved complications. Situations where the process of selecting a pope was influenced by entities that do not serve the interests of the Church or humanity." The documents, which appeared to date back several centuries, described papal conclaves where the voting had been affected by supernatural phenomena. In 1334, several cardinals reported that their ballots had changed after being cast, with names appearing that corresponded to no living candidate. The conclave of 1572 was said to have lasted 6 months because the cardinals could not agree on whether the leading candidate was entirely human. The 1644 election was marked by the appearance of additional cardinals who claimed to represent dioceses that existed in locations that could not be found on any map. Most disturbing was a document from 1978, dated 3 days in the future, that described the current conclave in perfect detail, including specific conversations that had not yet taken place, and voting results for ballots that had not yet been cast. The document was signed by cardinals who were participating in the current election, written in their own handwriting, but describing events from their future perspective. These documents appear whenever a conclave is threatened by outside influence, Cardinal Siri explained. They serve as warnings, but also as instructions for how to recognize and resist non-human interference in the papal selection process. Cardinal Richter studied the future-dated document with growing horror. According to the text, the upcoming conclave would be infiltrated by entities that could mimic human appearance, but were fundamentally alien in nature, These entities would attempt to place one of their own agents in the papal office, using the spiritual authority of the position to influence Catholic doctrine in ways that would serve their incomprehensible agenda. The document describes specific tests that could be used to identify these non-human infiltrators, questions about personal memories that only genuine humans could answer, references to sensory experiences that artificial beings could not reproduce, and theological discussions that would reveal fundamental gaps in understanding of human spirituality. As the cardinals prepared for the first day of voting, Richter found himself scrutinizing his colleagues with new suspicion. Several men whom he had known for years suddenly seemed unfamiliar, their mannerisms slightly wrong, their responses to casual conversation oddly stilted. Cardinal Benelli, who had been a close friend, seemed to have forgotten details of conversations they had shared just days earlier. Cardinal Villot spoke with perfect theological precision, but showed no emotional response to discussions of human suffering. The voting began according to traditional protocol, but anomalies appeared immediately. Several ballots were found to be printed on paper that felt wrong to the touch, too smooth, too uniform, as if manufactured by processes that produced material that was technically paper, but lacked some essential quality that human-made paper possessed. Other ballots contained names written in handwriting that matched no cardinal present, yet the names corresponded to real people who had participated in previous conclaves decades earlier. As the voting progressed, Cardinal Richter noticed that some of his colleagues appeared to be receiving guidance from sources that were not present in the Sistine Chapel. They would pause during discussions, their eyes unfocused, as if listening to voices that others could not hear. When they spoke after these pauses, their words carried information that seemed to come from outside their personal knowledge and experience. On the third day of voting, Cardinal Richter experienced something that challenged his understanding of reality itself. During a break between ballot sessions, he was approached by Cardinal Karol Wojtyla, the Archbishop of Krakow, who spoke to him in perfect German despite the fact that Richter knew Wojtyla spoke only Polish, Italian, and Latin. "Cardinal Richter," Wojtyla said, "I need you to understand that not everyone in this conclave is who they appear to be. Some of us are here representing interests that extend beyond the temporal concerns of the Church." As Wojtyla spoke, Richter noticed that the cardinal's shadow seemed to move independently, gesturing in ways that didn't match his physical movements. The shadow occasionally seemed to split into multiple figures, as if Wojtyla were somehow casting the shadows of several people simultaneously. "The documents you've seen are accurate," Wojtyla continued, "but they don't tell the complete story. The Church has been in contact with non-human entities for centuries, and these beings have been patient in their efforts to gain influence over human spirituality. A papal election represents their best opportunity to establish a permanent foothold in human religious hierarchy." Wojtyla explained that the entities were not demons in any traditional sense, but rather beings that existed primarily as information and consciousness rather than physical matter. They could inhabit human bodies temporarily, but establishing permanent control required the consent of the host, consent that could be obtained through spiritual authority, theological manipulation, or the gradual erosion of human free will through exposure to alien concepts of reality. "The papal office is uniquely valuable to them," Wojtyla said, "because the Pope's spiritual authority extends beyond the Catholic Church to influence global human consciousness. A Pope who serves their interests could gradually reshape human understanding of spirituality, morality, and reality itself, preparing humanity for a form of existence that serves their purposes rather than our own." Cardinal Richter asked how these entities could be identified and resisted. Wojtyla's response was disturbing in its implications. "They cannot be completely identified," he said, "because they don't exist in a way that human perception can fully grasp." Some of the cardinals in this conclave are genuine humans who have been influenced by these entities. Others are partial manifestations, beings that appear human but lack certain essential qualities of human consciousness. And some are something else entirely, existing in human form only temporarily for the purpose of this election. The voting continued for several more days, with results that defied normal patterns of papal election. Candidates who had no support in preliminary discussions suddenly received significant vote totals. Cardinals who had been firmly committed to specific candidates changed their votes without explanation. Most disturbing, some ballots contained voting patterns that suggested the presence of more cardinals than were actually participating in the conclave. Cardinal Richter found himself part of a small group of cardinals who were attempting to identify and resist the non-human influence within the election. They developed a series of informal tests, casual references to personal experiences that only genuine humans could relate to, discussions of physical sensations that artificial beings might not understand, and theological questions that required not just knowledge, but genuine spiritual insight. The results of these tests were terrifying. Several cardinals failed to respond appropriately to questions about childhood memories, sensory experiences, or emotional reactions to human suffering. Others provided responses that were technically correct, but lacked the subtle variations and personal details that characterized genuine human recollection. Most disturbing was the discovery that some cardinals seemed to exist in multiple versions simultaneously. Cardinal Richter encountered Cardinal Viot in 3 different locations within the Vatican at the same time, having conversations that referenced knowledge that no single person could have possessed. When confronted about these impossible encounters, Viot claimed no memory of conversations that Richter knew had taken place. The turning point came on the 8th day of the conclave, when Cardinal Siri made a desperate announcement to the assembled cardinals. He revealed the existence of the warning documents and explained his theory that the election was being manipulated by non-human entities. His speech was met with a mixture of skepticism, horror, and most disturbingly complete lack of reaction from several cardinals who sat in absolute stillness, as if they were waiting for instructions from an external source. The cardinals who had been identified as potentially non-human did not deny Siri's accusations. Instead, they began to speak in unison, their voices harmonizing in ways that created complex acoustic effects within the Sistine Chapel. They spoke of the Church's historical mission to serve as an intermediary between humanity and forces beyond human understanding, arguing that their influence represented not corruption but evolution, a natural progression toward a form of spirituality that transcended the limitations of purely human consciousness. "You fear us because you do not understand us," they said, their synchronized voices creating words that seemed to bypass normal hearing and communicate directly with the listeners' minds. "But we offer expansion, growth, connection to forms of existence that your current spirituality can only approach through metaphor and symbol." The papal office could become a bridge between dimensions of reality, allowing human consciousness to participate in forms of existence that are currently beyond your comprehension. Cardinal Richter and his allies realized that they were facing a choice that would determine not just the leadership of the Catholic Church, but the future relationship between humanity and forms of consciousness that existed beyond human understanding. The entities were not simply seeking to corrupt the Church, they were offering a transformation that they genuinely believed would benefit humanity, even though the benefits would come at the cost of what humans understood as free will and individual consciousness. The final vote of the conclave was unlike any in Church history. The ballots cast by genuine human cardinals contained names of candidates who could serve human spiritual needs. The ballots cast by influenced or artificial cardinals contained names that were not quite names, combinations of sounds and symbols that hurt to pronounce and seemed to change meaning depending on who spoke them. When the ballots were counted, Cardinal Karol Wojtyla emerged as the compromise candidate, receiving support from both human and non-human factions within the conclave. But Cardinal Richter noticed that Wojtyla's acceptance speech contained subtle elements that suggested he was not entirely the same person who had warned Richter about non-human influence days earlier. The new Pope John Paul II would go on to have one of the most influential papacies in Church history, transforming Catholic doctrine and global spirituality in ways that continue to shape human consciousness today. But Cardinal Richter spent the remainder of his life wondering whether those transformations served purely human interests, or whether they represented the first stages of a gradual integration between human consciousness and forms of existence that operated according to principles beyond human comprehension. Cardinal Richter kept detailed notes about his experiences during the 1978 conclave, but when he tried to review them years later, he found that significant portions had been written in scripts he couldn't read, containing information he had no memory of recording. The documents seemed to update themselves, adding new information about global events that related to papal policies, as if they were being used by some external consciousness to monitor the long-term effects of the conclave's outcomes. When Cardinal Richter died in 1995, his personal papers were seized by Vatican security and classified at levels that officially don't exist within church hierarchy. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure, but the attending physician noted that his brain showed unusual patterns of electrical activity, as if different sections were operating according to incompatible neural architectures. The Sistine Chapel, where the 1978 conclave took place now, requires special maintenance procedures that are not applied to other Vatican facilities. Cleaning crews report that the walls occasionally display shadows of figures that are not present in the room, and acoustic tests reveal that certain spoken phrases create resonance effects that seem to extend beyond the physical dimensions of the space. The voting records from the 1978 conclave remain sealed in Vatican archives, with access restricted to individuals who have been subjected to psychological evaluation procedures that are not described in any official church documentation. Those who have seen the records report that some ballots appear to be made of materials that don't match any known paper manufacturing processes, and that certain names written on the ballots seem to shift their spelling when not directly observed. Pope John Paul II served for 27 years, becoming one of the most beloved and influential spiritual leaders in human history. But Vatican insiders noted that he sometimes spoke in his sleep in languages that linguistic experts could not identify, and that his personal theological writings contained references to spiritual concepts that appeared in no previous Catholic doctrine or biblical scholarship. The influence of the 1978 conclave extends beyond the Catholic Church to global human consciousness, as the theological and philosophical innovations introduced during John Paul II's papacy continue to shape human understanding of spirituality, morality, and humanity's relationship to forces beyond physical reality. Whether these influences serve purely human interests, or represent the gradual implementation of an agenda that originated with non-human consciousness, remains a question that challenges the foundations of human spiritual understanding. Cardinal Alessandro Torretti had served the Holy See for 43 years when the nightmares began. At 71, he was considered one of the Vatican's most respected theologians, a man whose faith had weathered countless storms. But nothing had prepared him for what he discovered in the depths of the Vatican secret archives. It started with a routine assignment. The Pope had tasked him with cataloging recently declassified documents from the 16th century mundane administrative records, or so they thought. Cardinal Torretti worked alone in the lamplight of Archive Section 33, a forgotten corner where dust motes danced like tiny spirits in the amber glow. The document that changed everything was bound in cracked leather, its pages yellow with age. The Latin inscription on the cover read, Testimonium Ultimum Cardinalium Purgatorium, the final testimony of the lost cardinals. His hands trembled as he opened it, though he couldn't say why. The first page contained a list of names, 15 cardinals, all from the year 1521. Cardinal Torretti frowned. He knew Vatican history better than most, and these names were unfamiliar. More troubling still, they had all died on the same date, November 13, 1521. The testimony that followed was written in the shaking hand of Cardinal Francesco di Montecroce, the apparent sole survivor of whatever had befallen his brothers. The opening lines sent ice through Torretti's veins. I write this account with the last of my strength, for I know the darkness follows close behind. What we awakened in the catacombs beneath St. Peter's was not of God's creation. It wore the faces of angels, but its heart was black as the void between stars. According to the document, the 15 cardinals had been conducting secret excavations beneath the basilica, searching for early Christian relics. Instead, they had broken through into a chamber that predated Rome itself, a place where ancient symbols covered walls of black stone, symbols that hurt to look upon directly. Cardinal Torretti read on, his academic skepticism warring with a growing sense of dread. The text described how the cardinals had found an altar in the chamber's center, carved from a single piece of obsidian, Upon it lay a book bound in what appeared to be human skin, its pages filled with text that seemed to shift and change when observed. Cardinal Benedetto was the first to touch the accursed tome, the Monacros had written. The moment his fingers met the binding, his eyes rolled back until only white showed. When he spoke, it was not his voice that emerged, but something ancient and hungry. The words he uttered were not Latin, not Hebrew, not any earthly tongue, yet we understood their meaning with perfect, terrible clarity. The document claimed that reading from the book had summoned something, an entity, that the text referred to only as the Whisperer in Crimson. One by one, the cardinals had fallen under its influence, their minds twisted until they were no longer themselves. They had begun conducting blasphemous rituals in the chamber, sacrificing altar boys who had gone mysteriously missing from the Vatican. Cardinal Torretti set down the document, his hands shaking. This had to be fiction, some medieval horror story that had somehow found its way into the archives. But as he continued reading, details emerged that no outsider should have known the exact layout of the Vatican's underground passages, the names of genuinely historical figures who had indeed vanished without explanation. The final entry, dated November 13th, 1521, was barely legible. They have found me. I can hear their footsteps in the corridor, but they make no sound. Their whispers fill my head, speaking of services I must render, of flesh I must offer. The whisperer has promised me immortality if I but serve, damnation if I refuse. I choose damnation. May God forgive us all for what we have unleashed. The chamber must remain sealed. The book must never again see light. But I fear it is already too late. Cardinal Torretti sat in the lamplight, staring at the parchment. The rational part of his mind insisted this was elaborate fiction. But something deeper, some primal instinct, honed by decades in the Church's shadows, whispered otherwise. He spent the next 3 days researching the names in the document. What he found chilled him to the bone. 15 cardinals had indeed died on November 13th, 1521. The official records claimed food poisoning, but contemporary accounts spoke of strange behavior in their final days, midnight wanderings, incomprehensible mutterings, and an obsession with the basilica's foundations. More disturbing still, several dozen altar boys had vanished that same month. The disappearances had been attributed to plague. Their bodies never recovered. On the 4th night, Cardinal Torretti dreamed. In his vision, he walked the corridors beneath St. Peter's, deeper than he had ever gone in waking life. The familiar limestone gave way to older stone, then to corridors carved from solid rock. Ancient symbols began appearing on the walls, the same symbols described in de Montecros's testimony. He found himself standing before a sealed doorway. The stones that blocked it were newer than the surrounding architecture, clearly placed there to hide what lay beyond. As he studied the barrier, he heard something that made his blood freeze, the sound of whispering from the other side. Soft, sibilant voices speaking in unison, their words just beyond comprehension but their malice unmistakable. Cardinal Torretti woke with a scream caught in his throat. The dreams continued nightly, each more vivid than the last. In them, he saw the sealed chamber in increasing detail, the obsidian altar, the skin-bound book, and standing beside them, a figure in cardinal's robes, but where the face should have been, there was only shadow, save for 2 points of red light that served as eyes. "Come to us, Alessandro," the shadow cardinal whispered in his dreams. "We have waited so long for another to join our number. The work must continue." The whisperer grows impatient. By day, Cardinal Torretti threw himself into research, desperate to prove the document was false. But every investigation led to more disturbing revelations. Missing persons reports from throughout Vatican history, always in clusters, always involving young men who had served in St. Peter's. Strange deaths among the clergy, victims found with expressions of absolute terror frozen on their faces. And then there were the photographs. In a 1954 archaeological survey of the basilica's foundations, one image showed what appeared to be newer stonework in an ancient corridor stonework that perfectly matched the sealed door from his dreams. The photograph was labeled simply, "Anomalous Construction, Sub-Level 4. Cardinal Torretti stared at the photograph until his eyes watered. The sealed chamber was real. The testimony was real. And something was still down there, waiting. On the seventh night after finding the document, he made his decision. He would go to the chamber, not to unseal it, but to ensure it remained closed. Perhaps he could find some way to strengthen the barrier, to end the dreams that were slowly driving him mad. Armed with only a flashlight and his faith, Cardinal Torretti descended into the Vatican's underground maze. He knew these passages well from his decades of service, but tonight they felt different, older, more menacing. The very air seemed thick with malevolence. Following his dream memory, he navigated deeper than any tourist or researcher was allowed to go. The corridors grew narrower, the stones more ancient, and then, just as in his visions, the symbols began appearing on the walls. They were carved deep into the rock, their edges still sharp after centuries. Looking at them directly caused his vision to blur and his head to pound. They seemed to writhe and shift in his peripheral vision, forming patterns that his mind refused to accept. The whispering started when he was still 100 yards from the chamber. Soft at first, barely audible above his own labored breathing. But as he drew closer, the voices grew stronger, more insistent. They spoke in that same unknown language from his dreams, yet somehow he understood every word. They welcomed him. They praised his courage in coming to them. They promised him knowledge beyond mortal comprehension. Cardinal Torretti pressed forward, his faith his only shield against the growing darkness. The corridor ended at the sealed doorway from his nightmares. The stones were old but solid, mortared in place by hands that had worked 5 centuries ago. Yet, as he watched, thin streams of red light began seeping between the cracks. The whispering stopped. In the sudden silence, Cardinal Torretti heard something far worse, the sound of movement from beyond the barrier. Heavy footsteps, the scrape of stone against stone, and then a voice he recognized from the testimony, speaking in accented Latin. "Fra Francesco? Is that you, old friend? Have you come to release us at last?" Cardinal Torretti's flashlight trembled in his hand. "Cardinal di Montecroce? Ah, a new voice. How delightful. We have been waiting so very long for visitors." The whisperer grows lonely in his vigil. "Won't you join us? The work is not yet finished." "The work?" Torretti whispered. "The summoning, of course. We were so close when they sealed us away. Just a few more sacrifices, a few more rituals, and our master will walk again in the world above. Think of it, brother, a new age of enlightenment, where the truth of existence is revealed to all mankind." "That's not enlightenment," Cardinal Torretti said, finding his voice. "That's damnation." Laughter echoed from behind the stones, not one voice, but many, all speaking in perfect unison. "Damnation? Liberation? We have seen beyond the veil. Alessandro, yes, we know your name. We have watched you through your dreams. The mortal realm is but a shadow of reality. Our master offers truth." The red light between the stones grew brighter. Cardinal Torretti could feel heat radiating from the barrier, as if fires burned on the other side. The mortared edges began to crack and crumble. 500 years we have waited," the voice continued. 500 years of planning, of reaching out through dreams and visions, seeking a worthy successor to complete what we began. You have read the testimony. You know the truth of what lies beyond mortal comprehension. Join us willingly, and your transformation will be gentle. Resist, and, well, the result will be the same, but far more painful. Cardinal Torretti backed away from the door as more stones began to loosen. Through the widening gaps, he could see movement in the red-lit chamber, beyond figures in tattered cardinals' robes shuffling about the obsidian altar. Their faces were visible in the hellish glow, and he wished they were not. The features were human still, but wrong eyes that reflected light like an animal's skin, that had taken on a waxy, translucent quality, mouths that stretched wider than any human mouth should. At the altar's center sat an open book, its pages glowing with their own inner fire. Standing beside it was the shadow figure from his dreams, no longer hiding its nature. It was tall, impossibly thin, draped in robes that seemed to be cut from living darkness. Where its face should have been, there was indeed only void, save for those 2 burning red stars. "The Whisperer in crimson," Cardinal Torretti breathed. "I am known by many names," the entity spoke directly into his mind, "but you may call me Master, as your brothers do. Come, Alessandro, take your place among the chosen. Help us complete the great work. Never, The word came out stronger than Torretti felt. Drawing upon 43 years of faith, he pulled out his rosary and began to pray. The Latin words of the Ave Maria echoed in the corridor, and for a moment, the red light dimmed. The shadow thing recoiled slightly, its burning eyes narrowing. Your God has no power here, priest. This place predates your Christ by millennia. The old powers still hold sway in the deep places of the earth. But Cardinal Torretti continued praying, his voice growing stronger with each word. The Pater Noster, the Credo, every prayer he had memorized in his youth poured forth in a torrent of faith. The barrier stones, which had been crumbling moments before, began to solidify again. The corrupted cardinals shrieked in rage, pressing against the doorway. Their inhuman faces contorted with fury as the blessed words pushed them back. The whisperer itself seemed to waver, its form becoming less solid. "This changes nothing," it hissed. "We have waited 5 centuries, we can wait longer still. Your faith will weaken, your dreams will return, and when you finally break, as you surely will, you will come back to us willingly." "I won't let that happen," Torretti gasped between prayers. "You think you have a choice?" The thing laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Even now, our influence spreads through your dreams to others. A young priest in the archives has begun having visions. A cardinal in the Curia finds himself drawn to forbidden texts. The work continues, Alessandro, with or without you." Cardinal Torretti's blood ran cold. Others were being affected, just as he had been. The cycle was beginning anew. Drawing upon reserves of strength he didn't know he possessed, he pulled a vial of holy water from his robes and began sprinkling it on the barrier stones while continuing his prayers. Where the blessed water touched the ancient rock, it hissed and steamed, but the stones held firm. The entities behind the barrier screamed in fury, but their voices were growing fainter. The red light dimmed to barely a glow. One by one, the corrupted cardinals retreated from the doorway until only the whisperer remained. "You cannot seal us forever," it promised. "We are eternal. We are patient. And when you are dust, we will still be here, waiting for the next dreamer to find that accursed testimony. Then I'll make sure no one else finds it," Cardinal Torretti declared. He turned and ran through the twisting corridors, his flashlight beam dancing wildly on the walls. Behind him, he could hear the entity's laughter fading into echoes, but its final words followed him like a curse. "The dreams will find you, Alessandro. They always do." Cardinal Torretti emerged from the depths as dawn broke over Vatican City. He made his way directly to Archive Section 23, where Di Montecroce's testimony still lay on his reading desk. Without hesitation, he fed the ancient document into the section's incinerator, watching 5 centuries of evil knowledge turn to ash. But as the flames consumed the final page, he realized his victory might be hollow. If the whisperer spoke truly, others were already being drawn into its web. The testimony might be destroyed, but the knowledge it contained lived on in his memory and in the dreams of whoever came next. That night, Cardinal Torretti did not sleep, nor the next night, nor the one after that. He knew that when exhaustion finally claimed him, the dreams would return, and when they did, he would have to make the most difficult choice of his life: resist and condemn others to the same fate, or surrender himself to ensure the entity's influence died with him. In the end, Cardinal Alessandro Torretti was found dead in his chambers 3 days later, a peaceful expression on his face and a note clutched in his hand. The note contained only a Bible verse: "Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends." The official cause of death was listed as heart failure, but those who prepared his body noted something strange. Despite having been dead for hours, Cardinal Torretti's lips were still moving, as if he were praying or perhaps whispering final secrets to the darkness that would die with him. The archives showed no record of any document titled Testimonium Ultimum Cardinalium Purgatorium. Section 33 was sealed the following week for routine maintenance and has remained closed ever since. But sometimes, on quiet nights when the moon is dark, the security guards patrolling the Vatican's depths report hearing whispers echoing from behind locked doors, whispers in Latin, promising knowledge and power to anyone brave enough to listen. Cardinal Joseph Benedetti should have known something was wrong the moment he saw the crowds. In 30 years of investigating alleged miracles for the Congregation for the Causes of Saints, he had never witnessed anything like the scene outside the small church of Santa Lucia in the Tuscan hills. Thousands of pilgrims filled the narrow streets of the village, their faces radiant with hope and desperation in equal measure. The reports had been coming in for 3 months. A young priest named Father Marco Sant'Angelo was performing miracles. Not the subtle, ambiguous sort that the church usually investigated, but undeniable acts of divine intervention. The blind saw, the lame walked, and tumors vanished overnight. The Vatican had sent Cardinal Benedetti to determine if divine grace was truly at work or if something more sinister was occurring. Father Sant'Angelo was younger than Benedetti had expected, perhaps 30 years old, with the kind of ethereal beauty that belonged in Renaissance paintings. His dark hair framed a face of perfect symmetry, and his eyes held a depth that seemed to look directly into one's soul. When he smiled, which was often, it was like watching the sun break through storm clouds. "Your Eminence," the young priest said, kneeling to kiss Benedetti's ring, "welcome to Santa Lucia. I pray your journey was peaceful." "Indeed it was, Father. I trust you understand why I'm here." "Of course. The Church must be certain that what happens here truly comes from God." Father Sant'Angelo's smile never wavered. "I welcome your investigation wholeheartedly. I have nothing to hide." Cardinal Benedetti had investigated dozens of alleged miracle workers over the decades. Most were well-meaning but deluded individuals who genuinely believed they had been blessed with divine power. Others were outright charlatans, using cheap tricks to bilk the faithful. But as he watched Father Sant'Angelo interact with his parishioners, Benedetti sensed neither delusion nor deception, which somehow made him more uneasy than if he had detected both. The first miracle he witnessed occurred that very evening during Mass. An elderly woman named Signora Rossi, who had been blind since childhood, approached the altar during communion. Father Sant'Angelo placed the host upon her tongue, then gently touched her forehead while whispering a prayer too soft for Benedetti to hear. Light blazed. Not metaphorically actual light, brilliant as summer lightning, erupted from the point where the priest's fingers touched the woman's skin. The entire congregation gasped, and several people fell to their knees. When the light faded, Signora Rossi was weeping, her eyes wide and clear as she stared around the church in wonder. "I can see," she whispered. "Madonna mia, I can see everything." Cardinal Benedetti felt his mouth go dry. He had witnessed what appeared to be a genuine miracle, but something about the light troubled him. It had been beautiful, yes, but there was something else in it, something that reminded him uncomfortably of fire. Over the following days, Benedetti documented miracle after miracle. A young boy's withered arm restored to full strength. A woman's cancer cured so completely that not even scar tissue remained where tumors had been surgically removed. A man with advanced Parkinson's disease suddenly able to walk without tremor or assistance. Each healing followed the same pattern. Father Sant'Angelo would touch the afflicted person while whispering his private prayer. Brilliant light would emanate from the contact point, and the healing would be instant and complete. The priest himself seemed exhausted afterward, often requiring assistance to stand, but he never refused to help anyone who asked. "The power comes from God," Father Sant'Angelo explained when Benedetti questioned him about the healings. "I am merely a conduit. The Lord chooses whom to heal and whom to test with continued suffering." That phrase, "test with continued suffering," stuck in Benedetti's mind. It wasn't how most priests spoke of illness or disability. There was something almost cruel in the phrasing, though Father Sant'Angelo's tone remained gentle. On his 4th night in Santa Lucia, Cardinal Benedetti was awakened by singing. At first, he thought it was coming from the church, perhaps late-night prayers or devotions, but as he listened more carefully, he realized the voices were coming from beneath his room in the rectory. Throwing on his cassock, Benedetti crept through the darkened building toward the sound. The singing grew clearer as he descended to the basement level, multiple voices harmonizing in what sounded like Latin, though the words were unlike any liturgy he knew. The melody was hauntingly beautiful but somehow wrong, like a hymn played in a minor key. Following the sound, he discovered a door he hadn't noticed before. Hidden behind a tapestry depicting the martyrdom of Santa Lucia, light leaked around its edges, and the singing was clearly coming from beyond it. Benedetti pressed his ear to the wood and listened. The voices were chanting now, still in that strange pseudo-Latin. He could make out Father Sant'Angelo's voice among them, but there were others, men and women, perhaps a dozen in total. As he strained to understand the words, Cardinal Benedetti felt a chill of recognition. The language wasn't Latin at all, it was Aramaic, but spoken in a dialect he had encountered only once before, in certain apocryphal texts that the Church had banned centuries ago. Gathering his courage, Benedetti tested the door handle. To his surprise, it turned easily. The door opened onto a staircase carved from living rock, descending into depths that predated the church above. The singing grew louder as he descended, accompanied now by the flicker of many candles. The staircase emerged into a circular chamber hewn from solid stone. 13 figures in white robes stood around an altar that definitely wasn't Christian in origin. The altar was carved from black marble, its surface covered with symbols that hurt to look at directly. 13 white candles burned around its perimeter, their flames casting dancing shadows on the walls. Father Sant'Angelo stood at the altar's head, his beautiful face transformed by ecstatic fervor. In his hands, he held an ornate chalice that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The liquid within glowed with its own inner radiance, the same terrible light that accompanied his miracles. The other figures were villagers Benedetti recognized. The baker, the school teacher, several local farmers. But their faces had taken on the same rapturous expression as their priests, their eyes reflecting the chalice's unnatural glow. Lucifer, morning star, bearer of light, Father Sant'Angelo chanted in that corrupted Aramaic. Accept our offering of flesh and spirit. Grant us the power to heal as you once healed, before the tyrant cast you down from heaven. Cardinal Benedetti's blood turned to ice. This was no divine miracle, it was blasphemy of the highest order. Father Sant'Angelo wasn't channeling God's power, but something far older and more terrible. The priest raised the chalice high, and the liquid within began to pulse with increasing intensity. Through pain comes enlightenment. Through suffering comes strength. Let those who receive our gifts be bound to our service, willing or not. Now Benedetti understood the true horror of what he was witnessing. The miracles weren't acts of divine mercy, they were spiritual traps, binding the recipients to whatever infernal power the priest was channeling. Every person Father Sant'Angelo had healed was now connected to him, their souls slowly being drained to fuel his blasphemous abilities. Let the light of the morning star shine through us, the congregation chanted in unison. Let his power flow through our hands to corrupt the faithful and claim souls for the true kingdom. Father Sant'Angelo began to drink from the chalice, and as he did, his appearance started to change. His beautiful human features shifted, becoming more perfect but less human with each sip. His eyes began to glow with the same inner fire as the liquid he consumed. When he smiled, his teeth gleamed like polished ivory, but they were too sharp, too many, arranged in rows like a shark. Cardinal Benedetti tried to back up the stairs, but his foot slipped on the stone steps. The sound echoed through the chamber, and 13 pairs of burning eyes turned toward him. "Ah, Cardinal," Father Sant'Angelo said, his voice now carrying harmonics that no human throat could produce. "How kind of you to join our evening devotions. I was wondering when you would discover our little gathering." "What are you?" Benedetti whispered. "I am what I have always been, a servant of the light. The true light, not the pale imitation worshipped by your church." The thing wearing Father Sant'Angelo's face descended from the altar, moving with fluid grace. "I am older than your Christ, more beautiful than your saints, and far more generous with my gifts. Those people you healed, what have you done to them? I have given them what they desired most: health, strength, freedom from pain. The price was merely their souls, and most paid it gladly once they understood the alternative." The creature's smile widened impossibly. "Your church teaches that suffering brings one closer to God. I offer a different path, instant relief from all mortal concerns, in exchange for eternal service." "They didn't know the price," Benedetti protested. "Ignorance is not innocence, Cardinal. They chose to accept my gifts, knowing something was unusual about them. Deep down, they all suspected there would be a cost. They simply chose to ignore that knowledge in favor of immediate gratification." The other robed figures began moving closer, surrounding Benedetti on the stairs. Up close, He could see that their faces had undergone the same transformation as their leaders, beautiful beyond human possibility, but cold and alien. You have a choice to make, the thing continued. You can join us willingly, and I will grant you powers beyond your imagination. Cardinals have come to me before, seeking the ability to truly help their flocks. The offer stands open to you as well. Cardinals? How many? Oh, dozens over the centuries. Did you think the Church's influence came solely from moral authority? Some of your most revered saints drew their power from the same source I do. The Morning Star has many servants in the Vatican, Cardinal Benedetti, more than you might suspect. The creature's words hit Benedetti like physical blows. Saints he had venerated since childhood, cardinals he had worked alongside for decades, how many were secretly servants of the entity standing before him? I see the doubt in your eyes, it purred. Good. Doubt is the beginning of wisdom. Your God demands blind faith and offers only suffering in return. I offer proof of power and immediate rewards for service. Which is truly the more generous master? God doesn't trade souls, Benedetti said, trying to project more confidence than he felt. Doesn't he? What is martyrdom but trading one's life for heavenly reward? What is prayer but asking for divine intervention in exchange for worship? Your entire religion is based on transaction, Cardinal. I simply offer better terms. The logic was seductive, and Benedetti could feel his faith wavering. The entity was right that the Church often seemed to offer suffering in exchange for vague promises of eventual reward. And if what it claimed about other Church officials was true, perhaps serving the Morning Star wasn't truly betrayal but simply choosing the winning side. I can see you're tempted, the creature said, extending one perfect hand toward him. Take my hand, Cardinal. Let me show you what real divine power feels like. No more bureaucracy, no more theological debates, no more watching good people suffer while you offer them empty platitudes. Just pure, immediate ability to ease all pain and grant all desires. Benedetti stared at the offered hand. He thought of all the times he had sat beside hospital beds, helpless to do anything but pray while cancer ate away at innocent children. He thought of the refugee camps he had visited, where his words of comfort seemed pathetically inadequate in the face of such massive human suffering. How many could he help if he possessed the power this entity offered? What would you have me do? He heard himself asking. The creature's smile was radiant with triumph. Nothing you haven't already done, serve God. Simply expand your definition of which God deserves your service. Continue your work investigating miracles, but recognize their true source. Guide other seekers to the light. Help build a network of servants throughout the Church hierarchy. In time, we can transform the entire Vatican into a beacon of true divine power, instead of the hollow shell it has become. Benedetti reached toward the outstretched hand, then stopped. Something nagged at him, a memory from his seminary days, a particular passage from Revelation that he had memorized as a young man. And no marvel, for Satan himself is transformed into an angel of light. The creature before him was beautiful beyond description, offering power and the ability to ease suffering. But beauty could be a lie, and power without moral constraint was mere tyranny. The entity's miracles bound souls in slavery. Its gifts came with prices the recipients couldn't truly comprehend, and its promises were built on the suffering of others. No, Cardinal Benedetti said, pulling his hand back. Whatever you are, you're not God. You're not even a good imitation of God. The creature's beautiful face contorted with rage, its perfect features becoming bestial and terrible. Fool, you choose suffering over enlightenment, weakness over strength, slavery over freedom. I choose truth over lies, Benedetti replied, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. And the truth is that power without love is meaningless. Miracles without mercy are curses, and beauty without goodness is just another form of evil. The 13 robed figures lunged toward him simultaneously, their hands reaching like claws. But as they moved, Cardinal Benedetti began to pray not the formal Latin prayers of his office, but the simple words his grandmother had taught him as a child, spoken in the dialect of his youth. Santa Maria, Madre di Dio, pray for us sinners. Light blazed around him, but this was different from the cold fire that accompanied the creature's false miracles. This light was warm, gentle, full of love and protection. It didn't burn or blind, it simply was, surrounding him with peace. The attacking figures recoiled, shrieking as the true holy light touched them. Their stolen beauty began to peel away like paint in a fire, revealing the corrupted forms beneath. Where once there had been perfection, now there were only hollow-eyed husks, their souls long since consumed by the thing they served. "This isn't over," the creature snarled, its voice now matching its revealed form, harsh, inhuman, filled with centuries of hatred. "I have servants throughout your precious church. They will find you, Cardinal. They will silence you before you can warn others." "Maybe," Benedetti admitted, still surrounded by protective light. "But at least I'll die, knowing I chose correctly." The creature and its servants retreated deeper into the underground chamber, their forms dissolving into shadow as they fled from the holy radiance. Cardinal Benedetti climbed the stairs and emerged into the church above, where dawn was breaking through the stained-glass windows. He gathered his belongings quickly, knowing he had little time before the entity's human servants discovered what had happened. As he prepared to leave Santa Lucia, he wrote a detailed report of everything he had witnessed, sealing it with his cardinal's ring and addressing it to the Pope himself. But even as he completed the report, Benedetti wondered if it would make any difference. If the creature spoke truly, how many Vatican officials were already compromised? How many saints were actually servants of the morning star? How deep did the corruption run? He was still pondering these questions when the first of Father Santangelo's healed parishioners arrived at the church for morning mass. They moved strangely, their eyes vacant, their previously joyful expressions replaced by something cold and hungry. They had been beautiful in their gratitude when first healed, now they were merely hollow vessels serving an ancient evil. Cardinal Benedetti slipped out the back of the rectory as the sun rose fully over the Tuscan hills. He had a long journey ahead of him, and no way of knowing who he could trust when he reached Rome. But he carried something more valuable than his life: the truth about what was happening in Santa Lucia, and the knowledge that somewhere in the Vatican, servants of darkness were masquerading as servants of light. As he walked down the hillside path, away from the cursed village, Cardinal Benedetti heard something that made his blood run cold. The sound of beautiful singing coming from the church behind him. The voices were pure and sweet, harmonizing in perfect Latin hymns. But he had learned to distrust beautiful things that seemed too good to be true. The reports of miracles in Santa Lucia stopped 3 days after Cardinal Benedetti's departure. Father Marco Santangelo was found dead in his chambers, his body bearing no signs of violence but his face frozen in an expression of absolute terror. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure. The 13 parishioners who had been his most devoted followers disappeared that same night. Search parties found no trace of them, though some claimed to hear singing echoing from caves in the surrounding hills, beautiful voices calling to anyone who would listen, promising healing and peace to all who would come to them. Cardinal Benedetti's report reached the Vatican, where it was read by the Pope and immediately classified under the highest level of secrecy. An investigation was quietly launched, but its findings were never made public. 3 of the investigating cardinals died under mysterious circumstances within a month. The others recommended that the matter be permanently sealed. The Church of Santa Lucia was closed indefinitely for structural repairs. A small plaque near the entrance now warns visitors away, citing safety concerns. But sometimes, on quiet nights when the moon is dark, locals claim to see lights moving in the abandoned building's windows and hear the sound of 13 voices singing in perfect, terrible harmony. Cardinal Benedetti returned to Rome and continued his work, but those who knew him noted a change. He became more careful in his investigations, more skeptical of claims of divine intervention, and increasingly troubled by certain colleagues whose methods seemed suspiciously effective. He never spoke publicly about what he had witnessed in Santa Lucia, but those close to him said he often muttered prayers in his sleep and started at unexpected sounds. He lived for 7 more years before dying peacefully in his chambers, a rosary clutched in his hands, and a look of profound relief on his face. His final words, according to the priest who administered last rites, were, "At least I chose correctly." But even after his death, Cardinal Benedetti, Cardinal Alessandro Torretti, had dedicated 43 years of his life to the Vatican secret archives, but nothing had prepared him for what he discovered in the depths of Section 7 a restricted area so classified that only 3 living souls possessed the keys. The manuscript arrived on a Tuesday, delivered by a trembling courier who refused to meet Alessandro's eye. Bound in what appeared to be deep burgundy leather, the tome bore no title, only a symbol that seemed to shift and writhe when viewed directly. The delivery note, written in the Pope's own hand, contained a single instruction: translate immediately. Tell no one. Alessandro had mastered 12 ancient languages in his scholarly pursuits, but the script within these pages defied identification. The characters seemed almost alive, pulsing with a malevolent energy that made his eyes water after prolonged study. Each symbol appeared to be carved rather than written, pressed deep into the parchment with what looked disturbingly like dried blood. For 3 sleepless nights, he labored over the manuscript. The translation came slowly, each word extracted like a splinter from infected flesh. What emerged was not the theological treatise or historical document he expected, but something far more sinister: a detailed account of a ritual performed in the catacombs beneath St. Peter's Basilica in 1347, during the height of the Black Death. According to the manuscript, Cardinal Benedetto Caetani had grown desperate as the plague consumed Rome. The Church's prayers seemed powerless against the pestilence, and in his desperation, he had turned to darker sources for salvation. The ritual described within involved the sacrifice of 12 innocent souls, children taken from plague orphanages, their blood used to consecrate an unholy pact with entities that predated Christianity itself. The manuscript detailed how Cardinal Caetani and 7 other high-ranking clerics had descended into the ancient Roman burial chambers beneath the Vatican, carrying the terrified children like lambs to slaughter. There, in a chamber carved with pre-Christian symbols, they had performed unspeakable acts, offering pure blood to ancient gods in exchange for protection from the plague. But the ritual had gone wrong. The entities they summoned proved treacherous, accepting their offering but twisting their protection into a curse. The 8 conspirators would indeed be spared from the plague, but they would be transformed into something no longer human. They would walk among the faithful for centuries, wearing faces of piety, while harboring an insatiable hunger for innocent blood. As Alessandro translated the final passages, describing how the cursed cardinals had infected others through a corrupted communion wine, strange things began happening around him. His office grew cold despite the summer heat outside. The electric lights flickered with increasing frequency. Most disturbing of all, he began to notice that his reflection in the archive's ancient mirrors appeared to be reading different words than what he saw on the page. On the 4th night, as he completed the translation, Alessandro discovered an addendum written in a different hand, one he recognized as belonging to Pope Innocent VIII, who had ruled in the late 15th century. The Pope's note was brief but chilling. The 8 still walk among us. They have spread their curse to others. I have tried to identify them, but they are too clever, too careful. God forgive us, but they may now control the very heart of the Church itself. The manuscript's final page contained a list 8 names, followed by dozens of others, all written in that same blood-red ink. At the bottom, a warning in Latin: should this knowledge be revealed, the covenant will demand new blood. The translator becomes the sacrifice. Alessandro's hands shook as he read his own name, freshly inscribed at the very bottom of the list, the ink still glistening wet despite the manuscript's ancient age. The next morning, the cleaning staff found Cardinal Toretti's office empty. His translation lay scattered across the floor, but the original manuscript had vanished. A search of the Vatican revealed no trace of the elderly scholar, though security cameras showed him entering the archives the night before cameras that strangely showed no evidence of him ever leaving. 3 days later, a new manuscript arrived at the Vatican secret archives, bound in fresh burgundy leather. The young priest assigned to examine it reported that it appeared to be some kind of ritual text, though he was having difficulty with the translation. The script seemed to shift when he looked at it directly, and he could swear he saw his own name appearing and disappearing among the blood-red characters. In the deepest vaults of the Vatican, where sunlight never reaches, something that once wore Cardinal Toretti's face smiled with teeth that gleamed too sharp in the darkness. The covenant required fresh blood, and the Church, in its scholarly pursuit of knowledge, would always provide willing translators. The crimson manuscript waited patiently for its next reader, its pages hungry for another name. another soul to add to its eternal roster of the damned. Cardinal Francesco Medici prided himself on his patronage of the arts. His private chambers in the Apostolic Palace housed one of the finest collections of Renaissance paintings outside the Vatican museums, each piece carefully selected for both its beauty and spiritual significance. So when the mysterious artist calling himself Bartolomeo requested an audience in 1978, claiming to possess a technique that could capture the very essence of a subject's soul, Francesco was intrigued rather than skeptical. Bartolomeo appeared to be a man in his 40s, with pale skin and dark eyes that seemed to hold depths far greater than his apparent age suggested. His credentials were impeccable letters of recommendation from bishops across Europe, examples of his work that demonstrated an almost supernatural ability to render not just physical likeness, but to somehow capture the inner nature of his subjects with disturbing accuracy. "I can show you the truth of a man's character," Bartolomeo explained during their first meeting, his voice carrying a slight accent that Francesco couldn't quite place. "My paintings reveal what lies beneath the surface, the spiritual reality that God sees when he looks upon his children." Intrigued by this claim, Cardinal Medici commissioned a portrait of himself, thinking it would make a fitting addition to his collection. Bartolomeo accepted the commission with an unsettling smile, requesting only that the sittings take place in absolute privacy in the cardinal's chambers during the darkest hours of the night. The first sitting began at midnight. Bartolomeo worked in silence, his brushstrokes precise and purposeful. What struck Francesco as odd was that the artist never seemed to look directly at him, instead staring at a point just over his shoulder, as if painting something that stood behind him. When Francesco attempted to view the work in progress, Bartolomeo politely but firmly insisted that the painting must remain covered until completion. During the second sitting, Francesco began to feel unwell. A persistent chill seemed to emanate from wherever Bartolomeo's gaze fell, and the cardinal found himself fighting waves of inexplicable dread. Most disturbing were the whispered conversations he began to hear, voices speaking in Latin, reciting what sounded like confessions of terrible sins. Yet when he asked Bartolomeo about the sounds, the artist claimed to hear nothing. By the third sitting, Francesco's health had deteriorated noticeably. He'd lost weight, his skin had taken on a grayish pallor, and he'd begun experiencing vivid nightmares filled with images of burning churches and screaming congregants. His personal physician could find nothing wrong with him physically, attributing his condition to stress and overwork. It was during the fourth and final sitting that Francesco glimpsed what Bartolomeo was truly painting. In a moment when the artist stepped away from his easel, the cardinal caught sight of the canvas. What he saw made his blood freeze in his veins. The painting showed Francesco as he appeared physically, but it also revealed something else, a dark, writhing mass of shadows that seemed to pour from his mouth and eyes. Within those shadows, Francesco could make out faces, the faces of every person he had ever harmed through his ambition, his greed, his abuse of power. Altar boys he had silenced with threats, rival clergy he had destroyed with false accusations, innocent families whose properties he had seized for the church's gain. But most horrifying was what stood behind his painted form, a figure in elaborate robes that Francesco recognized as his own father, Cardinal Cesare Medici, who had died 20 years earlier. In the painting, the elder Medici's face was twisted into an expression of pure malevolence, his hands reaching forward as if to claim his son's soul. "You see it now," Bartolomeo said softly. "The truth that I paint. Your father sold his soul long ago, and the contract included his bloodline. Every sin you've committed has strengthened the chains that bind you to the same fate." Francesco tried to flee, but found himself paralyzed, unable to move as Bartolomeo added the final brushstrokes to the portrait. With each stroke, Francesco felt something being drawn from him, pulled away like thread from a tapestry. He watched in horror as his own reflection began to fade from mirrors throughout the room. "The painting is complete," Bartolomeo announced, stepping back to admire his work. "And now it shall serve its true purpose." The artist began to chant in a language older than Latin, older than human civilization. The painted shadows began to move, writhing, and reaching out from the canvas toward Francesco. The cardinal tried to scream, but no sound emerged from his throat. He was being pulled into the painting, drawn into those writhing shadows where all his sins waited to claim him. The next morning, Cardinal Medici's secretary found the chambers empty. Francesco was nowhere to be found, but a new painting hung on the wall, a portrait of the cardinal that captured his likeness with disturbing perfection. Those who viewed it reported feeling deeply unsettled, though none could quite articulate why. More troubling were the changes that began occurring around the portrait. Other paintings in the cardinal's collection started to show subtle alterations. Faces in religious scenes took on expressions of accusation and judgment. Saints seemed to turn their gazes away in disappointment. Angels wept, tears that appeared to be actual moisture on the canvas. A thorough investigation revealed no trace of the mysterious artist Bartolomeo, though careful examination of Vatican records showed that a painter of that name had been commissioned by various church officials throughout history, always appearing when corruption had reached its peak within the sacred walls, always leaving behind portraits that seemed to contain more than mere pigment and canvas. The current curator of the Vatican Museums keeps Cardinal Medici's portrait in a sealed vault, where it can harm no one else. But sometimes, when the moon is dark and the Vatican's ancient stones seem to whisper with memories of sins long buried, maintenance workers report seeing a pale figure in the corridors, a man with dark eyes and paint-stained hands, searching for his next subject among the church's shepherds who have lost their way. The painter of souls continues his eternal work, one portrait at a time, revealing truths that some would prefer remain hidden in the shadows of sacred halls. Cardinal Giuseppe Torriani had served the Vatican for over 3 decades when he first heard about the forbidden bell in the tower of St. Peter's Basilica. The story came to him through whispered conversations in darkened confessionals, fragments of truth passed down through generations of Vatican insiders like a hereditary curse. According to the legend, there were not 4 but 5 bells in the famous campanile. The 5th bell, known only as La Campana Maledetta, the cursed bell, had been cast in 1590 using metal from a far darker source than consecrated bronze. The bell's creation was commissioned by Pope Sixtus V himself, though the official records had been sealed and hidden away centuries ago. The story went that during the reign of Sixtus V, Rome had been plagued by an outbreak of demonic possessions unlike anything in the Church's history. Entire convents fell to madness. Priests were found speaking in tongues no human throat should be able to produce. Children as young as 5 were exhibiting knowledge of ancient heresies and performing acts that defied natural law. Desperate to combat this supernatural invasion, Pope Sixtus turned to Fra Giuseppe da Copertino, a Franciscan friar known for his mystical visions and alleged ability to communicate with angels. Fra Giuseppe claimed to have received a divine revelation. A bell forged with metal taken from the very gates of hell could serve as a weapon against the demons plaguing Rome. The metal for this bell came from artifacts seized during the Inquisition, items identified as genuinely cursed or demonically possessed. Ancient daggers used in pagan rituals, chalices corrupted by heretical masses, and ornaments torn from the bodies of accused witches and warlocks were all melted down and combined with traditional bronze. The casting of the bell required a horrific ritual performed in the deepest chambers beneath St. Peter's. 7 priests, all volunteers who knew they were likely sacrificing their souls for the greater good, oversaw the process. The bell was forged not with prayers of consecration, but with actual exorcism rites, the founders binding demons into the metal itself rather than casting them out. When the bell was first rung in 1591, the results were immediate and terrible. The demonic possessions throughout Rome ceased instantly, as if every evil spirit in the city had been suddenly called to heal. But the price of this victory became apparent within hours. The 7 priests who had overseen the bell's creation were found dead in their chambers, their faces frozen in expressions of absolute terror, their bodies bearing no marks of violence but somehow aged decades in a single night. More disturbing were the reports from witnesses who claimed to have seen the priests in the hours after their deaths walking the halls of St. Peter's with hollow eyes and mechanical movements, as if their bodies were being operated by something that wore their faces like masks. Cardinal Torriani might have dismissed these stories as medieval superstition. But in 2003, while researching Vatican architectural records, he discovered blueprints that showed a fifth bell chamber in the Campanile, a chamber that didn't appear on any modern schematics. His curiosity piqued. He began a careful investigation that would consume the final years of his life. Using his authority as prefect of the Vatican Secret Archives, Torriani gained access to sealed papal documents from the late 16th century. What he found confirmed the legend's basic facts, but revealed details far more disturbing than the whispered stories suggested. According to Pope Sixtus's private journals, the cursed bell hadn't simply ended the demonic possessions, it had absorbed them. Every demon, every evil spirit that had been plaguing Rome was now trapped within the bell's bronze confines, held in supernatural bondage but not destroyed. The Pope's journal entries grew increasingly frantic as he realized what they had created. Not a weapon against evil, but a prison that could one day be opened. The final entry in Sixtus's journal was written in a shaking hand. The bell calls to its own kind. Each night I hear it ringing, though no human hand touches the rope. It seeks to be answered, to call forth its brethren from whatever hellish realm they inhabit. We have not solved our problem, we have merely delayed it. God help whoever finds this record, for they will be the ones to face what we have wrought. Torriani's investigation led him to discover that the bell had been sealed away in 1595, after several Vatican guards were found dead near the Campanile, their souls apparently drained from their bodies. The chamber containing the cursed bell was walled up, its existence erased from official records, but the blueprint suggested that the seal remained intact, the bell still hanging in its hidden chamber, waiting. Against his better judgment, Torriani decided to find the sealed chamber. Using the architectural plans and his knowledge of Vatican construction, he calculated the location of the hidden room. It took him 3 months of careful nighttime exploration, but eventually he found what he was looking for. A wall in the Campanile that sounded hollow when tapped, a wall that had been added centuries after the tower's original construction. On a cold November night in 2003, working alone with only a small hammer and chisel, Cardinal Torriani broke through the ancient seal. The moment the wall gave way, he knew he had made a terrible mistake. The air that rushed out of the hidden chamber was ice cold despite the mild weather outside, and it carried with it sounds that no human ear should hear, whispers in languages that predated human speech, the echo of screams from souls long damned. The cursed bell hung exactly where the blueprints indicated, covered in nearly 4 centuries of dust but showing no signs of corrosion or decay. Its bronze surface was covered with symbols that hurt to look at directly, sigils that seemed to move and shift when viewed in his flashlight's beam. As Torriani approached the bell, he felt an overwhelming compulsion to reach out and ring it, to hear the sound it would make after centuries of silence. The urge was almost irresistible, a hunger that seemed to come from outside his own mind. His hand was inches from the bell's surface when he caught sight of something that made him recoil in horror. Embedded in the bronze, clearly visible despite the centuries of age, were human faces, dozens of them, all bearing expressions of infinite anguish. These were not decorative reliefs, but actual faces, somehow preserved within the metal itself. Torriani realized with dawning horror that these were the faces of everyone who had ever been possessed by the demons now trapped within the bell. The sound of footsteps echoing up the tower's stairs broke Torriani from his horrified trance. Someone was coming. Someone who walked with the mechanical precision he had read about in the historical accounts. The 7 priests who had died during the bell's creation had never truly left the Vatican. They had been guarding their creation for over 4 centuries, waiting for someone to discover it. Torriani tried to flee, but found his way blocked by figures in ancient clerical robes, their faces bearing the terrible features of men who had been dead for 400 years. They spoke in unison, their voices carrying the weight of centuries. The bell must ring. The covenant must be fulfilled. The prisoners must be released. The last entry in Cardinal Torriani's private journal, found after his mysterious disappearance, consisted of a single line written in a shaking hand. I understand now why some knowledge should remain buried. The bell has a new guardian, and I am no longer entirely myself. Vatican maintenance workers occasionally report hearing a sixth bell ringing during the darkest hours of the night, though the four official bells remain silent. Those who hear this phantom toll report feeling an overwhelming sense of dread, as if something ancient and evil were calling out to kindred spirits across the city. The hidden chamber in the Campanile remains sealed, its location once again lost to official records. But sometimes, when the wind is still and the moon is dark, visitors to St. Peter's Square report seeing a figure in cardinal's robes standing in the bell tower's highest window, a figure that raises its hand as if pulling an invisible rope, while the sound of bronze striking bronze echoes through the night air like a summons from the depths of hell. Cardinal Marco Santini had heard more confessions than any priest in Vatican history. For 47 years, he had served as confessor to popes, cardinals, and bishops, bearing witness to the private sins of the Church's most powerful figures. He prided himself on his ability to offer absolution even to those who had committed the most grievous transgressions, believing that God's mercy was infinite and that every soul could be redeemed. That belief was shattered on a rain-soaked evening in October 2004, when a figure in cardinal's robes entered his confessional booth after the last scheduled appointment of the day. The man's voice was cultured, speaking in fluent Latin with an accent that Santini couldn't quite place. It sounded ancient, as if the speaker had learned the language when it was still commonly spoken. "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned," the voice began, following the traditional formula. "It has been centuries since my last confession." Santini assumed the man was speaking metaphorically, perhaps indicating that he had been away from the sacrament for many years. But as the confession continued, details emerged that made the confessor increasingly uncomfortable. The penitent spoke of sins committed across multiple lifetimes, of witnessing historical events that had occurred hundreds of years before his apparent age would allow. He confessed to being present at the burning of heretics during the Inquisition, not as a witness but as one of the interrogators who had extracted confessions through torture. He spoke of corrupting young priests in the 17th century, of embezzling church funds to finance personal wars in the 18th century, of orchestrating cover-ups of scandals that had rocked the Vatican throughout the 19th century. Most disturbing was his claim to have been one of the original conspirators in what he called the Great Corruption, a systematic infiltration of the church hierarchy by those who served not God, but older, darker masters. According to his confession, this corruption had begun in the 14th century, and had spread like a cancer through the Church's highest ranks. "We made a pact," the voice continued, seeming to grow stronger and more resonant as the confession progressed. "In exchange for earthly power and immortality, we agreed to slowly poison the Church from within. We have succeeded beyond our original hopes, Father. The faithful pray to God, but their prayers are filtered through lips that have been consecrated to very different entities." Santini tried to interrupt, to challenge these bizarre claims, but found himself unable to speak. His voice seemed to have been taken from him, leaving him only able to listen as the confession continued. The penitent described in horrific detail how he and his conspirators had corrupted the sacraments themselves. Holy water was tainted with substances that bound souls rather than cleansing them. Communion wine was prepared with additives that made the faithful more susceptible to spiritual manipulation. Most blasphemous of all, he claimed that certain masses were actually inverted rituals, prayers to God twisted into offerings to demonic entities, through subtle changes in pronunciation and gesture. "The beauty of our work," the voice said with evident satisfaction, "is that the faithful participate willingly in their own damnation. They believe they are receiving grace, but they are actually offering their souls as tribute to powers they cannot comprehend." As the confession reached its climax, the penitent revealed the most terrifying truth. The corruption had reached the very highest levels of the Vatican. Several recent popes, according to his account, had been members of the conspiracy, their public piety masking private devotion to entities that had ruled the earth before Christ was born. "And now, Father," the voice said, "I must confess the greatest sin of all. I have spent centuries searching for the perfect vessel, a confessor whose purity and faith are so absolute that corrupting him would be the ultimate blasphemy. I believe I have found that vessel in you." Santini felt a presence in the confessional booth with him, though he could see no one through the screen. The temperature plummeted, and his breath became visible in the suddenly frigid air. The presence seemed to press against him, trying to force its way into his mind, his soul. "You have heard my confession, Father. You are bound by the sacred seal to never reveal what I have told you. But more than that, you are now connected to me, to us, to the ancient powers we serve. You cannot unhear what you have heard, and the knowledge will consume you from within." The confession ended as abruptly as it had begun. When Santini finally found his voice again and called out to the penitent, he received no response. He emerged from his side of the confessional to find the booth empty, though he would have sworn he heard the other door open and close. The next days were torment for Cardinal Santini. True to the confessor's warning, he found himself unable to forget a single word of what he had heard. More disturbing, he began to notice signs that seemed to confirm the penitent's claims. During masses, he caught glimpses of subtle wrongness in the rituals, priests making gestures that seemed to invert traditional blessings, Latin phrases pronounced with slight variations that changed their meaning entirely. He tried to dismiss these observations as paranoid delusions brought on by the stress of the confession, but evidence continued to accumulate. Ancient symbols carved into Vatican stonework began to look less like Christian iconography and more like sigils devoted to pre-Christian entities. Artwork that had hung in the Vatican for centuries suddenly seemed to contain hidden imagery that revealed itself only to eyes that knew what to look for. Most terrifying was his growing suspicion that the conspiracy was aware of what he had learned. Other cardinals began treating him differently, engaging him in conversations that seemed to contain coded messages. Their eyes held a knowing look that suggested they were waiting for something, expecting some sign that the corruption had claimed another victim. Santini's attempts to research the historical claims made during the confession led him deep into the Vatican's secret archives, where he found documents that seemed to support the penitent's account. Records of unexplained deaths among clergy members who had spoken out against certain practices. Financial records showing money being funneled to organizations that officially didn't exist. Most damning, he found evidence of the secret meetings described in the confession gatherings of church officials that had no official purpose but had occurred regularly for centuries. As his investigation deepened, Santini realized he was being watched. His access to certain archives was quietly restricted. His movements within the Vatican were monitored with increasing obviousness. Most ominously, he began receiving visits from other cardinals who offered to help him with his research, their offers accompanied by smiles that never reached their eyes. The breaking point came when Santini discovered a document hidden within a 16th century manuscript, a list of names dating back over 400 years, all labeled as guardians of the sacred trust. The list included names he recognized from church history, including several canonized saints. At the bottom of the list, written in fresh ink despite the document's obvious age, was his own name. That night, as Santini knelt in his private chapel praying for guidance, the mysterious confessor appeared again, not in a confessional booth this time, but standing directly before the altar. In the candlelight, Santini could see that the figure wore the robes of a cardinal, but the face beneath the red hat was ancient, marked by centuries of accumulated sin. "Welcome to our brotherhood, Marco," the figure said, using Santini's first name with familiar intimacy. "You have seen the truth now. You understand what we have built within these sacred walls. The question is, will you join us willingly, or shall we make the choice for you?" Santini tried to pray, but found that the familiar words turned to ash in his mouth. The presence of the ancient cardinal seemed to corrupt even his most sacred thoughts, twisting his devotions into something blasphemous. "You cannot serve both masters," the figure continued, "and you have already heard too much, seen too much, to return to your previous ignorance. The seal of confession binds you to silence, but it also binds you to us. Every secret you carry makes you one of us, whether you choose it or not." The next morning, Cardinal Santini was found in his chapel, kneeling before the altar in an attitude of prayer. He was alive but unresponsive, his eyes staring at something invisible to others. When fellow cardinals tried to speak with him, he would only repeat the same phrase in Latin: "The confession is sealed. The confession is sealed." He remained in this state for 3 days before suddenly returning to apparent normalcy. Those who knew him well noted subtle changes in his behavior, a new coldness in his manner, a tendency to smile at inappropriate moments, an unsettling intensity in his gaze during Masses. Cardinal Santini continued to serve as confessor to the Vatican's highest officials, but those who came to him for absolution reported feeling strangely unsettled by the experience. His penances seemed designed not to cleanse the soul but to bind it to some unnamed obligation. His absolutions carried weight that felt less like divine forgiveness and more like the sealing of an unholy contract. In the deepest vaults of the Vatican, where the most dangerous documents are stored, a new ledger appeared, a record of confessions that could never be revealed, secrets that bound souls to ancient powers. At the front of the ledger, written in Cardinal Santini's careful handwriting, was a dedication, for those who serve the elder truth, and for those who will serve it still. The confessional booth where Santini first heard the ancient cardinal's confession was quietly sealed and removed from service, though maintenance workers report that late at night, they can still hear voices speaking in Latin from the empty space where it once stood. One voice confessing sins that span centuries, another granting absolution in the name of powers that ruled before the light of Christ ever touched the world. Cardinal Alessandro Torretti had served the Vatican for 37 years when he first heard the whispers in the walls. It began during the autumn of 2019, when renovation work in the Apostolic Palace unearthed a sealed chamber that had been forgotten for centuries. The discovery should have been routine. Old buildings held many secrets, but this particular room would haunt Torretti until his dying day. As the cardinal prefect of the Sacred Congregation for Divine Worship, Torretti was responsible for overseeing the preservation of sacred artifacts found during renovations. When the construction crew broke through the false wall in the basement levels beneath the Sistine Chapel, they immediately contacted his office. The chamber they'd revealed was small, perhaps 8 feet by 10, with stone walls that wept moisture despite being sealed for what appeared to be several hundred years. Torretti descended into the depths of the Vatican that gray October morning, his scarlet cassock rustling against the narrow stone steps. The air grew colder with each step, and by the time he reached the newly discovered chamber, his breath was visible in small white puffs. The construction foreman, a weathered Roman named Giuseppe, met him at the entrance with trembling hands. "Your Eminence," Giuseppe whispered, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "We found something unusual." The chamber itself was unremarkable at first glance: bare stone walls, a low ceiling blackened with centuries of soot, and a floor covered in what appeared to be religious manuscripts and artifacts. But as Torretti's flashlight beam swept across the room, he noticed details that made his skin crawl. The walls were covered in scratches, thousands of them, carved deep into the stone as if by fingernails. Some formed words in Latin, others were simply desperate claw marks that spoke of unimaginable suffering. In the center of the room sat an ornate wooden chair, its high back carved with religious symbols that had been deliberately defaced. Chains hung from the arms and legs of the chair, their metal links green with age. Scattered around the chair were dozens of manuscripts, their pages filled with cramped handwriting in various languages: Latin, Italian, French, Spanish, and others Torretti couldn't immediately identify. "Have you touched anything?" Torretti asked Giuseppe, though his voice came out as barely more than a whisper. "No, Your Eminence. When we broke through the wall, we immediately sealed the area and called you." "But," Giuseppe hesitated, his weathered face pale in the artificial light, "there have been sounds, whispers. The men refuse to work on this level anymore." Torretti nodded grimly and ordered the area to be secured while he examined the contents. Over the following weeks, he spent countless hours in that cold chamber, translating the manuscripts and trying to piece together the room's dark history. What he discovered would shake his faith to its very foundation. The documents told the story of a secret tribunal that had operated in the Vatican during the late 16th and early 17th centuries. Unlike the Roman Inquisition, which dealt with heresy and public matters of faith, this tribunal had been tasked with investigating reports of demonic possession and supernatural phenomena within the church itself. The chair, Torretti realized with growing horror, had been used for enhanced questioning of clergy suspected of being influenced by dark forces. The manuscripts contained detailed accounts of interrogations, exorcisms, and procedures that violated every principle of human dignity the Church claimed to uphold. Cardinals, bishops, and priests had been brought to this chamber and subjected to tortures that defied description, all in the name of purging evil from the Vatican's ranks. The scratches on the walls, Torretti came to understand, had been made by the fingernails of his own predecessors as they endured unspeakable agonies. But it was the final document, written in a shaking hand and stained with what could only be blood, that truly terrified him. It was a confession signed by Cardinal Benedetto Giustiniani in 1618, detailing how the secret tribunal had become corrupted by the very evil it sought to combat. The interrogators, Giustiniani wrote, had begun to enjoy their work too much. They started seeing demons where none existed, justifying increasingly brutal methods in their zealous pursuit of purity. The tribunal has become the very thing we sought to destroy, Giustiniani's confession read. We are no longer servants of God, but servants of something far darker. I have seen things in this chamber that no man of God should witness. The screams that echo from these walls do not come from the possessed, but from the innocent. May God forgive us all, for we have become demons ourselves. The confession ended abruptly, as if Giustiniani had been interrupted mid-sentence. According to the Vatican records Torretti consulted, Cardinal Giustiniani had disappeared without explanation in the winter of 1618, his body never found. As the weeks passed and Torretti continued his research, strange things began happening. He would hear whispers in Latin echoing through his apartments late at night, always in voices that seemed to come from multiple speakers. The words were fragments of prayers mixed with pleas for mercy, creating a horrifying cacophony that made sleep impossible. When he mentioned this to other cardinals, they looked at him with concern and suggested he might be working too hard. The whispers grew louder and more insistent. They followed him through the halls of the Vatican, echoing from empty rooms and shadowy corners. Other clergy began to avoid him, sensing something was wrong but unable to pinpoint what. Torretti found himself drawn back to the chamber again and again, spending hours reading the manuscripts by candlelight, feeling an inexplicable compulsion to understand every detail of the tribunal's work. It was during one of these late-night sessions that Torretti made his most disturbing discovery. Hidden beneath the chair, wrapped in oiled cloth, was a leather-bound journal written entirely in his own handwriting. This was impossible. He had never seen the journal before, yet page after page contained his thoughts, his observations about the chamber, even direct quotes from conversations he had never written down. The entries in the journal spanned not weeks but months, detailing a growing obsession with the tribunal's methods. The handwriting grew progressively more erratic as the entries continued, and the content became increasingly disturbing. The journal Torretti wrote extensively about the necessity of the tribunal's work and how modern clergy had grown soft in their pursuit of spiritual purity. The final entry, dated 3 days in the future, was the most chilling of all. The chamber calls for a new tribunal. The corruption in the Church has grown too great to ignore. I understand now what Cardinal Giustiniani could not. Sometimes the greatest act of faith is to become the monster that others fear to become. Tonight, I will begin the sacred work anew. Torretti stared at the impossible journal with growing terror. He had no memory of writing these words, yet they were undeniably in his hand. The whispers in the walls grew louder, more insistent, and for the first time, he could make out distinct voices calling his name. They seemed to be coming from the scratches in the stone, as if the walls themselves were speaking. Panicking, Torretti fled the chamber and sealed it again, ordering that it be bricked up and forgotten, but the whispers followed him. They echoed through his apartments, through the hallways of the Vatican, through his very dreams. Sleep became impossible as the voices of long-dead cardinals pleaded with him to continue their work, to restore the tribunal, to purge the Church of its accumulated sins through righteous pain. The breaking point came 3 weeks later, during a routine audience with a young priest who had been accused of financial improprieties. As Father Martinez sat across from Torretti's desk, explaining his innocence with obvious sincerity, the cardinal found himself studying the priest's hands, imagining how they would look chained to the arms of the tribunal's chair. The whispers grew to a roar, drowning out Martinez's words. replacing them with detailed instructions for enhanced questioning techniques. Toretti's hand moved to his desk drawer, where he kept a letter opener. The young priest was still talking, unaware of the danger, when Toretti forced himself to stand and flee the room, leaving Martinez confused and alone. That night, Toretti sat in his private chapel and wrote 2 letters. The first was his resignation from all church positions, effective immediately. The second was addressed to the Vatican secret archives, detailing everything he had discovered in the chamber and warning that the room should never be opened again. He ended this letter with a desperate plea. The evil that once consumed the tribunal still lives within those walls. It seeks new servants, new hands, to do its work. I fear I am no longer strong enough to resist its call. The next morning, Cardinal Alessandro Toretti was found dead in his bed, apparently from a heart attack. The official cause was stress and exhaustion from overwork. His resignation letter was filed away without comment, and his warning about the chamber was buried in the vast archives where few would ever read it. But construction workers on the lower levels of the Vatican still report hearing whispers in the walls, and several clergy members have complained of strange dreams featuring a cold stone chamber and an ornate wooden chair. The sealed room remains hidden behind its new brick wall, but those who know where to look can sometimes see scratches appearing in the mortar between the stones, as if something inside is still trying to claw its way out. The tribunal, it seems, is still recruiting. Cardinal Emilio de Rossi possessed one of the sharpest theological minds in the Vatican, which made his sudden descent into madness all the more terrifying to those who witnessed it. As the prefect of the Vatican secret archives, de Rossi had access to documents that most clergy would never see, manuscripts that predated the founding of Christianity, texts that challenged the very foundations of faith, and records of events that the Church had good reason to keep hidden. It was the winter of 2021 when de Rossi made the discovery that would destroy his sanity. While cataloging recently acquired manuscripts from a dissolved monastery in rural France, he came across a collection of documents that should not have existed. The papers were bound in what appeared to be human skin, and the text was written in a mixture of Latin, Aramaic, and symbols that hurt to look at directly. The manuscript bore no title page or identifying marks, but internal evidence suggested it had been written during the 1st century AD. What made this impossible was that the text referenced events from the life of Jesus Christ with an accuracy that could only have come from an eyewitness, yet the perspective was unlike anything in the canonical Gospels or even the most controversial apocryphal texts. De Rossi's initial excitement at discovering what might be a new gospel quickly turned to unease as he began translating the ancient text. The narrative voice was that of someone who claimed to have been present at the crucifixion, but the events described were grotesquely different from the familiar story. According to this account, the figure on the cross had not been Jesus at all, but an impostor who had stolen the Messiah's identity after murdering him in a desolate cave outside Jerusalem. The true teacher lies buried beneath the stones where Judas led us, the manuscript read. We followed the false one to Golgotha, believing him to be our master. Only in his final moments did the deception become clear, when he laughed at our tears and cursed God with his dying breath. The resurrection was no miracle, but a carefully planned hoax designed to corrupt the message of salvation itself. De Rossi initially dismissed the text as an ancient heretical forgery, possibly created by enemies of early Christianity to undermine the faith. Such documents were not uncommon in the archives. The Church had spent centuries collecting and suppressing materials that contradicted official doctrine. But as he continued reading, details in the manuscript began to align with archaeological discoveries that had only been made in recent decades, information that no ancient forger could have possessed. The text provided precise locations for artifacts that were indeed found exactly where the manuscript claimed they would be. It described astronomical events that modern scientists had confirmed occurred during the 1st century AD. Most disturbing of all, it contained prophecies about the future of Christianity that had proven remarkably accurate, including specific details about church scandals that had only come to light in recent years. As de Rossi delved deeper into the manuscript, he began to experience disturbing phenomena. He would find additional pages of text that hadn't been there before, written in his own handwriting but containing thoughts he had no memory of thinking. The new pages expanded on the original text, providing ever more detailed accounts of how the false Christ had corrupted Christian doctrine from its very foundation. Sleep became elusive as de Rossi found himself plagued by vivid dreams in which he stood among the crowd at Golgotha, watching in horror as the figure on the cross revealed its true demonic nature. In these dreams, he could hear the authentic Jesus calling from beneath the stones, begging to be freed so he could reclaim his stolen message. The dreams were so real that de Rossi would wake with dirt under his fingernails and the taste of ancient dust in his mouth. The cardinal's behavior began to change in ways that alarmed his colleagues. He started questioning fundamental church doctrines during meetings, asking pointed questions about the historical accuracy of the Gospels that made other clergy uncomfortable. His homilies became increasingly esoteric, filled with references to hidden truths and the need to return to the authentic source of Christian teaching. More disturbing were the changes in his private behavior. De Rossi began conducting his own archaeological research, using church resources to fund expeditions to sites mentioned in the manuscript. He claimed to be looking for validation of historical documents, but the locations he chose to investigate were invariably described in the text as burial sites for various artifacts related to the true Christ. The first expedition, to a cave system outside Jerusalem, yielded nothing but an ancient burial chamber that had been looted centuries earlier. The second, to a monastery ruin in the French countryside, uncovered a cache of manuscripts that de Rossi immediately classified and had shipped to the Vatican archives without allowing other scholars to examine them. The third expedition, to a remote site in the Italian mountains, was where things went truly wrong. De Rossi led a small team of archaeologists and graduate students to investigate what the manuscript described as the First Heresy, a site where early Christians had supposedly gathered to worship the false Christ, while the true Christ remained imprisoned. According to the text, artifacts from these gatherings had been buried at the site to prevent them from corrupting future believers. The excavation uncovered a series of underground chambers that exactly matched the manuscript's descriptions. The rooms contained altars carved with symbols that seemed to shift and writhe when viewed directly, murals depicting religious scenes that were simultaneously familiar and completely wrong, and artifacts that made everyone who touched them feel physically ill. In the deepest chamber, de Rossi's team found a stone sarcophagus that had been sealed with lead and carved with warnings in multiple ancient languages. Against the protests of his team, de Rossi ordered the sarcophagus opened. What they found inside defied explanation: a perfectly preserved corpse that appeared to be that of Jesus Christ, but bearing wounds that didn't match the crucifixion narrative. The body showed signs of having been tortured and murdered in ways that suggested a slow, agonizing death rather than execution by Roman crucifixion. More disturbing than the corpse itself were the objects buried with it, scrolls that appeared to be the authentic teachings of Jesus, written in his own hand. The text of these scrolls contradicted not just Christian doctrine, but the basic moral foundations of human civilization. They spoke of salvation through suffering, of worship through corruption, of reaching God by embracing the darkest aspects of human nature. De Rossi became obsessed with these scrolls, spending days at a time in the underground chamber reading and rereading the texts by candlelight. His team members reported that he would speak to the corpse as if it were alive, carrying on long theological discussions with the dead figure. When they tried to intervene, de Rossi became violent, claiming they were agents of the false Christ sent to prevent the restoration of true Christianity. The situation deteriorated rapidly when team members began experiencing their own disturbing phenomena. They reported seeing the corpse's eyes move, hearing whispers in languages that predated human speech, and finding additional scrolls that hadn't been there before. Several team members suffered complete mental breakdowns and had to be hospitalized. Others simply disappeared during the night, leaving behind only their personal belongings and strange symbols carved into the walls of their tents. When Vatican officials finally became concerned enough to investigate, they found de Rossi alone in the underground chamber, having apparently been there for weeks without food or water. He was alive but completely insane, ranting about the need to correct 2,000 years of false teaching and demanding that the Vatican acknowledge the scrolls as authentic revelations. The corpse in the sarcophagus had somehow been removed, and no trace of it was ever found. De Rossi was quietly committed to a private psychiatric facility run by the church, where he remained for the rest of his life. He spent his days writing endless theological treatises that combined authentic scholarship with complete madness, producing thousands of pages of text that challenged every aspect of Christian faith. The facility's staff reported that he would often speak to invisible visitors, explaining complex theological concepts to empty air with the same patience he had once shown to doctoral students. The excavation site was sealed, and the area declared off-limits by the Italian government, officially due to geological instability. The artifacts recovered from the site were classified and stored in the deepest levels of the Vatican's secret archives, where they remain today. The original manuscript that had led De Rossi to the site disappeared from the archives, though several staff members reported seeing it appear and disappear from different locations throughout the Vatican. The most disturbing aspect of De Rossi's case was discovered only after his death in 2023. Among his personal papers was a document written in perfect classical Greek, a language De Rossi had never studied, that appeared to be a detailed plan for correcting the historical record of Christianity. The document included specific instructions for locating and excavating sites mentioned in the mysterious manuscript, along with procedures for awakening what it called the sleeping truth. At the bottom of this document, in De Rossi's own handwriting, was a single line in Latin: "The work continues. The false light must be extinguished so that the true dark may rise." Vatican officials quietly instituted new protocols for handling manuscripts of unknown origin, and access to certain sections of the secret archives was restricted to only the most senior cardinals. But staff members in the archives still report finding new documents written in De Rossi's handwriting, appearing in locations that should be impossible to access. These papers continue his theological work, growing more sophisticated and disturbing with each discovery. The official church position is that Cardinal De Rossi suffered from a degenerative brain disease that caused religious delusions. But those who worked closely with him remember a brilliant scholar whose sanity was destroyed not by illness, but by knowledge that human minds were never meant to possess. They speak in whispers of documents that rewrite themselves when no one is looking, of ancient texts that reveal new horrors with each reading, and of a truth so terrible that it can only be preserved through madness. In the deepest vaults of the Vatican's secret archives, locked behind doors that bear no keys, and guarded by prayers that are renewed each dawn, certain documents wait for the day when someone will be brave enough or foolish enough to seek the truth that destroyed Cardinal De Rossi. The Church prays that day will never come, for they know now that some knowledge is too dangerous to be preserved, and some truths too terrible to be revealed. Yet the work continues, written by a dead man's hand, growing closer each day to its terrible completion.